parliamentary reporters to report the meeting, and also television coverage and web streaming would be adversely affected. The purpose of this part of the meeting is to have an engagement with a number of stakeholders in relation to the uptake of apprenticeships and traineeships. So on behalf of the committee, I wish to welcome Dr. Jim Murray, Director of Academic Affairs and Deputy CEO of the Technological Higher Education Association, Brendan McGinty, Chairperson of SkillNet Ireland, Mary Liz Trant, Executive Director of SOLAS, and Phil O'Flaherty, Principal Officer, Further Education and Training Section of the Department of Education and Skills. The format of this part of the meeting is that I will invite you to make a brief opening statement, maximum of 3 minutes, which will be followed by engagement with the members of the committee. But before we begin, I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. However, if you are directed by the Chair to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to so do, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make changes against any person or persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her or it identifiable. I also wish to advise you that any opening statements you have made to the committee will be published on the committee website after this meeting. And members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. So we will start now, and I'd like to call on Dr. Jim Murray, please, to make your opening statement.
Before the Speaker speaks, I'll have to leave for a few minutes at a certain point with Deputy O'Loughlin, who's on our way, but we'll both have to leave to do a press conference, so we'll be back. Just there's no disrespect shown.
Okay. So we call on Dr. Jim Murray to make your opening statement, please, on behalf of the Technological Higher Education Association.
Chair and committee members, on behalf of the Technological Higher Education Association and its members, the 14 institutes of technology, I would like to extend our thanks to you for the invitation to your meeting today to discuss the uptake of apprenticeships and traineeships. The technological higher education sector is a strong supporter of apprenticeship, and it will remain a key element of its provision into the future. The first technological university, TU Dublin, will be the largest educational facilitator of apprenticeship programmes in the country when it is designated in January 2019. 12 of THEA's 14 members contribute to the provision of the off-the-job elements of some 23 of the designated craft apprenticeships. Of the 9 new apprenticeships launched since 2016, 7 are led by THEA members as coordinating providers in areas as diverse as polymer processing technology and insurance practice. In addition, institutes of technology are the proposed coordinating providers for a further 10 new apprenticeships currently under development. Apprenticeship in the Irish context is a statutory national programme that enables the apprentice to earn and learn at the same time, and is traditionally associated with the construction, electrical, automotive and engineering industries. As you know, the great advantage of this approach is that it not only provides the opportunity to the apprentice to learn on the job, but also to participate fully as an employee in a real-world work environment. The new apprenticeships aim to extend this approach more broadly into sectors that have not traditionally been associated with apprenticeships. It is a fresh, ambitious and innovative undertaking which THEA believes has the potential to bring about very significant enhancements to the apprenticeship system as a whole and to those employment sectors that identify and choose it as the optimal model for educating and training their staff in particular occupations. THEA views statutory national apprenticeships as one key element in a broad family of education and training programmes that are based on a learn and work model. This model also includes traineeships and non-apprenticeship programmes provided by the further education and higher education sectors that have varying levels of non-paid work-based learning embedded within them. The latter include work placements integrated into regular degree programmes and bespoke programmes developed for individual companies. It is important to offer this mixed portfolio of work-based learning to enhance the employability of all graduates, and equally important that employment sectors give consideration to which model is most suited to their recruitment needs. Employers are primarily responsible for recruiting apprentices, not the education providers. Employers are best placed to comment on why there have been difficulties in recruiting apprentices in certain sectors. Our members are closer to the recruitment process of the new apprenticeships, and their experience to date suggests that recruitment tends to be more successful when an employment sector is well organised and has a strong professional association behind it that can determine whether apprenticeship is an appropriate work-based learning model for that sector. A strong professional association also helps to mobilise individual companies in recruiting apprentices and can support that recruitment directly. There are significant challenges for all stakeholders in increasing the uptake of apprenticeships and specifically in meeting the targets enunciated in the 2016 Action Plan. Arguably, the greatest challenge relates to enhancing awareness of apprenticeship amongst the populace at large. Although awareness of apprenticeship has increased in recent years at policy level in particular, it is a far greater communications challenge to raise public awareness of apprenticeship as a valid and valued option for school leavers. The magnitude of the task is reflected in the stark fact that the total apprenticeship population at the end of 2017-18 academic year was 14,871, while the total enrolments in public higher education coming into that year were 235,644. It is arguable too that there is a need to simplify the regulatory environment in which the apprenticeships system operates. It remains subject to the Industrial Training Act 1967, a piece of legislation that is 50 years old. While this legislation is sturdy and has stood the test of time, it is not easily reconciled with subsequent education and training legislation, particularly that relating to the National Quality Assurance System. It has led to a very complex and at times overly bureaucratic system within which to develop the new apprenticeship model. While all of the stakeholders have worked very collaboratively to make the system work, it has undoubtedly hindered the agility and the responsiveness of the system, delaying the throughput of programmes and making it difficult at times to predict and deliver registration targets. As national supporters of the apprenticeship model, THEA's views that the apprenticeship is an integral hub in the overall provision of education and training. Our members are significant providers and supporters of the model. We believe that with streamlined employer support, a focus on simplifying the interpretation of the regulations, a revisit of the recruitment targets in collaboration with the consortia and other stakeholders, and a targeted public awareness campaign, the model can be enhanced to reach its full potential. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Murray. And I now call on Brendan McGinty, Chairperson of SkillNet Ireland, please.
Chair, thank you for the opportunity to meet with the committee this morning. I know the primary focus today is on discussing issues of apprenticeship and traineeships, which for the most part is about points of entry into a career. Our focus in SkillNet Ireland in working with enterprise about developing employability skills over the work life cycle when people have taken up employment, so just to understand that context. As part of that context, obviously human capital is the single greatest asset any nation can possess. Workers, whether they're born here or attracted from abroad, are the muscle, the brain power, the creative force and the energy that drives our economy. In an international context, the IMD's Competitiveness Yearbook 2018 ranks Ireland 5th for attracting and retaining talent. The collective talent of our nation isn't just the bedrock of our economy today. A well-educated, well-skilled and adaptable workforce has been a core pillar of Ireland's economic and industrial policy since the 1960s and is an advantage we must never cede. If we're going to keep that advantage, if we're going to keep the promise of opportunity to future generations, we have some work to do. Our economy is being rapidly reshaped by technology, automation, globalisation, geopolitical shifts, including Brexit, and several other forces. The manifestation of changes being discussed in the debate on the future of work are already with us today and are influencing the way companies operate and how work is organised. This affects job content, skill needs and quality requirements. This transformation is creating opportunity, but is also creating disruption, and with it, insecurity for many businesses and workers. Some of this insecurity can be attributed to two gaps that are preventing our nation from leveraging its talent and our people from realising their full potential. The first is a skills gap. Too many people lack the skills they need to compete for 21st century jobs. And the second is a people gap. Too many businesses can't find the workers, and often with the right skills they need, when and where they need them. Closing both gaps is an imperative to our competitiveness. This is a multifaceted challenge, as skills supply is met in various parts through outputs from our higher and further education system, including apprenticeships and traineeships, from employment activation and supports to job seekers, and from immigration. However, for the greatest part, the skills that power Ireland's economy are derived from within employment. For this reason, it's crucial that both businesses and workers are placed at the heart of the response. SkillNet Ireland is the national agency responsible for the promotion and facilitation of in-employment training. We have deep roots with enterprise in Ireland, and we are contracted with over 50 employer groups, sectoral groups, regional representative bodies and industry associations. In 2017, 15,000 private firms participated in SkillNet learning networks, and over 50,000 workers were supported by SkillNet-funded training. We're funded from the National Training Fund and as a demand-side agency in that we stimulate and support enterprise-led responses through 65 learning networks across a range of sectors and regions. We operate a cost-sharing model where state grants are combined with investments by business. As well as offering a subsidy to encourage upskilling, cost-sharing derives from firm employer commitment to the training process. In 2017, employers made a total contribution towards training of £15.91 million through SkillNet. The SkillNet cost-sharing model is also creating significant funding leverage in that every €1 of state investment is matched by €1.14 from employer contributions. This represents a highly efficient use of public monies and an effective vehicle for state investment in the skills of our workers. For 2019, the annual budget allocation for SkillNet Ireland has been increased to £28 million, equating to about 4.5% of total NTF expenditure, net of other employer contributions. Through successive independent evaluations, both domestic and international, including the OECD, EU and the ILO, the SkillNet model has consistently been highlighted as an efficient means of addressing skills challenges. An enterprise...
You have gone over your time. Can I ask you to move to conclude your opening statement, or if you want to move just to conclude with your recommendations?
Yeah.
Please.
I suppose the particular recommendations I would like to make in particular is that the government, first of all, that the government maintain a rigorous focus on the skills of those in employment. The government direct supports it close to labour market skill requirements and in targeting interventions that support effective enterprise-led training and preparing more people to take up employment opportunities. The second is to implement the full recommendations arising from the independent evaluation of the NTF undertaken by Indicon, including a greater priority being placed on supporting in-employment training and giving enterprise a bigger voice in how this is determined. The third is to provide greater incentives to firms in order to increase investment at enterprise level in staff training, and such responses, we believe, will serve to increase the productivity, innovation and competitiveness of firms and boost the skills, career mobility of workers and the value of jobs. And the fourth then is to continue to expand demonstrably effective government enterprise upskilling mechanisms such as SkillNet Ireland to allow us to accelerate our work and penetration, particularly with SMEs who employ 70% of our workforce. I suppose just briefly in conclusion, Chair, what the key message is for committee members is that we're at a moment of rapid change and massive transition, and we have to put the talent agenda foremost in our minds. That requires us to bridge the gaps that exist between students and workers and the jobs that will provide them opportunity, security and prosperity, and it requires us to bridge the skills and people gaps that exist between the needs of employers and workers where businesses seek to expand their businesses, to serve their communities and to grow the economy. SkillNet Ireland provides strong leadership in shaping the future of workforce development by working with enterprise to meet their skill requirements and helping those in work to progress, develop and upskill for the future. We believe we're a strong example of how the state and enterprise can work together to meet identified challenges. With our deep roots in every region and sector, we're determined that these issues are addressed, and with the active support of government, of all our stakeholders and through collaboration between agencies, we're working hard to play our part in addressing those issues.
Thank you. And you will have an opportunity to engage further with members. Can I ask now for Mary Liz Trant, Executive Director of SOLAS, to present, please.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Chair and committee members. On behalf of SOLAS, I'm very pleased to make this statement to the Joint Committee for Education and Skills on the uptake of apprenticeships and traineeships. SOLAS funds and oversees further education and training in Ireland, which includes traineeships, and has statutory responsibility for the national apprenticeship system. The organisation has been closely involved in the national policy to expand apprenticeship and traineeship, supporting the Department of Education and Skills and working with education and training boards, higher education institutions, the HEA, QQI, the enterprise community, apprentices and trainees. Work has been underway since 2014 on the expansion of apprenticeship in Ireland, drawing on a strong track record, evidence that apprenticeship is an effective way to build the pipeline of talent within industry, and a vision of its potential to become a major route to skills development in Ireland. A National Apprenticeship Council, appointed by the Minister for Education and Skills, is steering the expansion of apprenticeships into new areas of industry and leading to awards from levels 5 to level 10 on the National Framework of Qualifications. Solas is represented on the Council and acts as the Council's Secretariat. As of this month, November 2018, the number of national apprenticeship programmes has increased to 42, up from 27 in 2016. A further 35 programmes are in development. Apprentice registrations have more than doubled, going from just under 2,000 in 2013 to over 4,500 as of the end of October 2018. Registrations on craft apprenticeships are exceeding forecasts, and while registrations on the 17 newer programmes have been lower than originally envisaged, these registrations are rising as programmes become more established. The new apprenticeships are developed and overseen by industry-led consortia, and during 2018, the Apprenticeship Council has begun engaging with these consortia to discuss progress, to discuss employer support for the new programmes and the ambition regarding targets for each apprenticeship to 2020. A review of pathways to participation in apprenticeship was completed this year. As the apprenticeship system expands, it is essential that skills development becomes a realistic, valued option through apprenticeship for the widest possible cohort of young and older citizens in Ireland. The review sets out 5 steps to tackle underrepresentation and exclusion in the apprenticeship system. A national promotional campaign, Generation Apprenticeship, has also been underway since May 2017, designed to engage and influence employers, parents, teachers and potential apprentices on the opportunities arising from apprenticeship programmes. Regarding traineeships, the number of programmes available via education and training boards has increased from 24 in 2016 to 51 as of this month. Education and training boards have been working with employer partners on expansion of offerings over the past 12 months in particular, since publication by Solas in partnership with ETBs of a 5-step guide to traineeship in Ireland. The target enrolments for traineeship in 2016 and 2017 were not achieved. However, enrolments have started to increase this year, and there are positive forecasts on traineeship enrolments over the period 2018 to 2020. The introduction in 2018 of Skills to Advance, a new policy to support upskilling of lower-skilled employees, is also enabling ETBs to adapt traineeship provision so that people at work can access this route to skills development. In conclusion, we ask the committee to note that overall apprentice registrations are increasing year on year, as are the number of participating employers. There are 17 new apprenticeship programmes now available, with 35 more in the pipeline. Apprentice registrations on new programmes are, however, in effect 1 year behind target. Buy-in by employers to the new and expanded apprenticeship offerings will be a key success factor. Regarding traineeship, enrolment targets have not so far been fully met. However, as of 2018, the trend in enrolments is upwards. There is a strong pipeline of 51 traineeship programmes now available and positive forecasting on numbers for 2019 and 2020. Similar to apprenticeship, employer buy-in to traineeships will be a key success factor over the next 2 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I call now on our final witness, Phil O'Flaherty, Principal Officer, Further Education and Training Section of the Department of Education and Skills, to make your opening statement, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to thank the Joint Committee for the opportunity to discuss this important area of apprenticeship and traineeship with you today. The expansion of apprenticeship and traineeship is a key priority for Government. The Programme for Government and the Action Plan for Education contain a commitment to having a cumulative 50,000 enrolments on apprenticeship and traineeship programmes between 2016 and 2020. This represents more than a doubling of activity over the period. Details of how this overall target will be reached through increased enrolments each year were set out in the Action Plan to expand apprenticeship and traineeship over the period 2016 to 2020, along with information on a range of supporting initiatives. Apprenticeship and traineeship are an important part of wider efforts to engage employers more closely in the education and training system and to ensure that education and training is meeting current and future skill needs. The programme to expand apprenticeship and traineeship was starting from a difficult position. Apprenticeships suffered enormously during the recession, with a fall in registrations of over 80%. This closed down an important avenue for young people. As well as giving access to valued careers for learners, apprenticeship and traineeship deliver talented and work-ready people for employers. Rebuilding these pathways to rewarding careers and increasing the pipeline of talent for employers has required significant work and new thinking. It was recognised that apprenticeship and traineeship needed to grow beyond the sectors of the economy that had traditionally engaged with the programmes, and that this would need an entirely new approach. Informed by an independent review of the apprenticeship system, the then Minister appointed the Apprenticeship Council in late 2014. The remit of the Council was to oversee the development of a range of new apprenticeships, initially through a call for proposals, and to examine the issues associated with creating a more flexible and accessible model of apprenticeship that could meet the needs of a diverse range of employers. Alongside this work, the curricula of existing craft apprenticeships were remodelled to keep pace with new methods and technologies in the workplace, and to ensure that apprentices have the broader range of literacy, numeracy, ICT and team working skills that they need to be successful. Work was also undertaken by SOLAS with the Education and Training Boards to engage with employers to develop a range of new traineeships in growing areas of employment. Really good progress has been made. There has been strong growth in apprenticeship registrations over recent years. 17 new programmes have been developed through 2 open calls for proposals issued by the Apprenticeship Council, and a strong pipeline of further programmes are in development. A completely new model of flexible, industry-led apprenticeship has been created, with a diverse range of programmes at levels 5 to 9 on the National Framework of Qualifications now in place. Craft apprenticeships are growing strongly, with industry re-engaging with apprenticeship recruitment. Nonetheless, there are challenges. Apprenticeship programmes have taken longer to get off the ground than originally envisaged, and registrations on new apprenticeships are approximately a year behind the target set in the action plan. Female participation in apprenticeship remains low, and recovery in numbers on craft apprenticeships has not been evenly spread across all trades. Traineeships, which in the past were primarily for unemployed people, saw some falls in enrolment as unemployment reduced significantly. However, there are plans in place to address these issues, and the Department is confident about the future of these important programmes. We're now in a new phase of development of apprenticeship and traineeship. All of the key building blocks are now in place, and there's an excellent base of new programmes. The focus is now on employers and learners. Through the Apprenticeship Council and other partners, we're working hard with employers to ensure that they fully exploit these new opportunities to develop the talent in their workforce. It's only through real partnership and employer support that these important pathways into employment for the first time or to career advancement can be opened up. Government is also working to address the visibility of apprenticeship and traineeship opportunities, to promote these pathways to women and other underrepresented groups, and to engage with the career guidance community. The Generation Apprenticeship campaign is in full swing, and the campaign has a lot to promote. Only in the last 2 weeks we've seen the first graduates from new apprenticeship programmes, hundreds of craft apprentices receiving their qualifications, the publication of a review of pathways to apprenticeship, and the launch of a number of new apprenticeship and traineeship programmes. Government, assisted by additional contributions from employers to the National Training Fund, has put significant additional resources into this area. An additional £27 million has been allocated in Budget 2019, a tangible commitment to these programmes at a time when there are many competing demands for investment in education and training. I look forward to hearing the contributions from the other bodies involved. In fact, I've already heard some of them invited to today's session, and to discussing progress made and the opportunities and challenges to come with committee members.
Thank you very much. I now call on Senator Moran to ask her questions.
Thank you. I have a few questions, but I suppose I'd like to start by saying that I'm a huge supporter of apprenticeships, but obviously I have a huge issue as well with the class dynamic of apprenticeships. And I just thought when Phil said that time underrepresented groups, I was wondering, was the underrepresented groups for once the middle and upper classes in terms of actually taking up such positions? I know for myself the schools that I work with around Dublin, we've one school, I won't name it, and it would be quite a middle class school, and they're literally coming to us and saying, how do we make apprenticeships attractive to the kids in their schools? And they're really struggling to actually get them on board with the whole idea of apprenticeships. And so when I think about apprenticeships, I do look at it through that lens in terms of my own school days, and how the majority of my friends and classmates, the only option for them was apprenticeship. So for me, it's always about the equality of access, and that apprenticeship is about choosing to do apprenticeships, not doing apprenticeships because it's the only thing that you've been told is going to be available to you because of where you're from and who you are. So I suppose one of my questions is, a lot of you have mentioned the growth in registration for apprenticeships, and just to say, like, on one hand there's a part of me that go, well, you know, it's good to just have people working, but for me I always have to think long term. Like, the evidence shows that if you come from a family that doesn't have, say your parents only have second level education, and you take up an apprenticeship, your social mobility will either keep going straight forward, or the social mobility of your children will continue to spiral down. So it's being able to fill that gap. That apprenticeship is not only about maintaining a certain amount of people in a certain sector of employment, but also that it's adding to the future progression and social mobility of them as young people, but also as them when they become parents themselves, and that what that means in terms of their profession, in terms of their children. So what I'm curious to know is, at this point, because there has been a widening out of the programmes, like different sectors, it's not the ones that would have been only available when I was in school, what is the demographics and the breakdowns of them, the growth? So I know Dr. Murray, you mentioned a figure of 14,871 in terms of registrations. Sulis mentioned a figure of 4,500 by the end of October. The department talks about strong growth, but for me, I'd really love to actually nail down into that and ask, what are the demographics, what is the social background of the parents of the children taking them up, what schools are they coming from, and if it is highly concentrated in the DESH schools and in the more working class communities, what exactly can we do to level out that playing field, that it is more attractive across the board? Because college is not for everyone, whether you're from a DESH school or a really good school. Apprenticeship needs to be a viable option for more than just a particular class of people, I suppose. So if anyone had them figures, it would be amazing to kind of get an understanding of that. Yeah, I think, I think that's mainly really my question. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Senator Ryan. And Senator Gallagher?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. First of all, I'd like to thank you for attending here this morning. Thank you all for your presentations. And I've seen figures recently. It was a European league table, and unfortunately, from an apprenticeship perspective, we in Ireland were very much at the bottom half of the table, both in the scale and the diversity of the apprenticeships that's on offer. And I suppose, listening to all the presentations this morning, if we were to put the scale of the problem in perspective, I think, Dr. Jim, in your figures that you've outlined there, and I think they're worth repeating, in the academic year 2017-2018, the total apprenticeship population was 14,871. And if you compare that to 235,644 that enrolled for the same academic year in public higher education, I think that, for me, nails the scale of the problem that we have in front of us. For years, and Lynn outlined it, excuse the expression, the sexy option was to go to higher education, and the lesser option, if I can use that expression, was for someone to pick up an apprenticeship and run with that. And I think that that's the scale of the problem, and the few things that sprung to mind. To my mind, if you look at those stats and you try and tackle those in a positive aspect, a few of you mentioned public awareness, and I think that's key. We need to do a massive amount of work in relation to public awareness in trying to attract people to the apprenticeship role. And if I think of my own county, and Catherine, you'd be familiar with the two County Monaghan. If I use the name Combi-Lift, most people in this room, I'd imagine, would be very familiar with it. And if I mention the name Martin McVicker, most people would associate Martin McVicker with Combi-Lift. And if we were looking for a poster boy, excuse the expression, or an ambassador for apprenticeships, then I think Martin McVicker would fit that role very, very well. He is now a managing director of a company that exports to over 100 countries worldwide. He went through the apprenticeship role, and he took that route as opposed to going to third level. And I think, as I said, if we're looking for an ambassador for apprenticeships, I think we could do worse than roll Martin McVicker, or maybe pick up the phone and give him a call. That's the first thing as regards public awareness. The other issue, I suppose, is employers. And I just wonder how much consultation there is currently with employers. It seems to me from listening to the presentation that, yes, this apprenticeship role, as far as we're concerned in this country, the journey is only beginning. And yes, we have made a start, and that's admirable, but we have so much more to do. And I think we need more consultation with employers in order to try and move this forward. And the other stat that strikes me, I've seen figures recently where apparently the female participation in apprenticeships in this country is 2%. And if we look at our closest neighbour in the UK, it's 50%. So clearly there's a lot to be done in that regard as well. And I wonder what your good selves think on what we can do in order to get that figure up as well. And I suppose, in summary, Chair, in relation to employers, I feel as though we need to incentivise employers to go down that road as well, and we need to incentivise those that are participating, and we need to show them a clear picture of what the end game will look like from them. So, from the employer's point of view, do you have anything in mind that could incentivise employers to go down this road, is number one. And is there, for people that's unemployed and perhaps see a job perhaps in an apprenticeship at initially at any rate at much better financially than what they would get if they were staying in social welfare, is there anything we can do there to incentivise them as well? Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. If members are agreeable, I'll take one more set of questions from Deputy Funchion, go back to the panel of witnesses and then come back for another group of 3. Is that okay? So, Deputy Funchion.
Thanks, Chair. First of all, apologies for being late for your presentations, but I did have had read your opening statements. I want to agree with a lot of what Senator Gallagher and Senator Moran have said. It seems like there's a lot of great ideas and a lot of good work going on to a certain extent, but my difficulty with it is I don't think that information is filtering down at local level. First of all, to people that might have an interest in apprenticeships. It seems to be very hard for them to get information, and for a lot of people their first point of contact will be a local social welfare office. And my experience of the people I deal with is they're more pointed in the direction of Turas Nua than any other option at all, whether it be some sort of a training scheme through Solace or whether it be an apprenticeship, but that information does not seem to be forthcoming. And then touching on what Senator Gallagher said in relation to employers, like I would know of a number of people that just cannot find apprentices, and then there's a bunch of people who are looking for information on how to get into an apprenticeship, and yet there's a lot of very good things being said here today. So somewhere along that there's a piece missing, or the information is not being followed down. And I don't know if any of you are actually in a position to answer this, but when people go into their social welfare office, like, what is this obsession with Turas Nua and funneling people towards that only? Because I think that's where a lot of the difficulties lie, because I would know of people who have been offered training schemes with Solace and Turas Nua are like, no, sorry, we can't release you for that. Really stupid stuff like that doesn't make any sense. So there needs to be something done in relation to sort of joining up all those dots. And the other thing I wanted to ask, for some apprenticeships, like somebody doing a barbering apprentice, and there's a fee attached to that, they have to fund that themselves, as far as I'm aware. Is there any option for them? Because they don't, let's say if you're coming from school and you haven't been unemployed for a year, you're not going to qualify for back to education, you don't qualify for SUSI, so where do they get that money? Do they just have to source it themselves? And that can be a deterrent, obviously, to people as well. So I'd just like to get some answers in relation to that. I think, as I said, it's sort of a bit of an ad hoc approach. Like, if you meet somebody locally, that's very good and will give you the information, that's great. But if you don't, it depends sort of where you are in the country, who you meet on a particular day. You know, there doesn't seem to be any kind of uniformity in relation to getting the information. Like, there was a private member's bill last week in relation to apprenticeships, and I think the Minister said there that there is some financial incentive for employers to take up apprentices. Now, I don't know if that is the case, but like, that information needs to sort of be get out there more if it is. I wanted to ask in relation to the women. It says, Phil, in your statement, how government is working to address, you know, the area around the problems with pathways to women for apprenticeships. I was just wondering, what are some of the practical steps that you're taking in relation to that, and are you looking at the issue of quality and affordable childcare, which is always a difficulty? And then this comes back to this, different areas and different departments not talking to each other, because sometimes to qualify for certain schemes, you need to be unemployed for a year, or there's other criteria, and you might qualify for this, but then that means you're not going to qualify for the affordable childcare. So just, what sort of kind of joined up thinking, or what sort of interdepartmental stuff happens in relation to all that, because they are a lot of the barriers for people, that it's just a minefield when you actually go to try and get the information. And then I just wanted to ask, again, I'm not sure, maybe Phil would be the most appropriate person to answer this, in relation to community education and the struggle that they have with funding and fees, and the introduction of fees for people who are trying to get back on their feet, trying to get either back into education, or as somebody I met yesterday said it very wisely, that this could be their first opportunity because the education system failed them in the first instance. And, if they're going to be forced to pay fees, and already so much community education struggles for funding, I know they don't like to have to ask, their students that are coming to them for fees. So just some of your opinions on that kind of stuff, because I do think there is some great things that you've suggested and you've said, and a lot of this came up last week as well, but just for me, it doesn't, on the ground practically, it doesn't seem to be funneling down to people, whether it's people who've left school early, or whether it's people who've done a leaving cert but want to do an apprenticeship rather than go on to higher education. There doesn't seem to be any the same funding stream for them, for example, like they don't qualify for SUSI, and yet financially, if they would actually qualify for it. So things like that, I think we need to look at, because it's not practical for a lot of people to pay those kind of fees, because you obviously, in relation to doing an apprenticeship, you're on extremely low wages, so it's not going to be viable for people to pay those fees. Thanks.
Thank you. And I would ask witnesses to indicate if they wish to respond to any of the comments or questions posed by members. Yes, Phil.
Thanks, Chair. Maybe I'm sure other panel members here will have perspectives on these things as well. I suppose it's probably important to kind of note at the outset, one of the big things that the review of apprenticeship back in 2013-14 did was it really conceived of apprenticeship more as a mode of learning, as opposed to as a very particular thing that operates in a very particular sector. For a long number of years, there were no new apprenticeships developed. I mean, it was essentially there within the construction sector, within the engineering sector, and obviously that goes to some of the issues around female recruitment also. And the intention in implementing the recommendations from the review was that apprenticeship should offer a much broader range of opportunities for people, both in terms of educational progression, so that the qualifications that they receive are a pathway into higher education or into career progression of various types. That it would involve the participation of a wide range of education and training providers, so that you can be an apprentice in a higher education institution. We have a couple of universities, for example, getting involved in apprenticeship. So to some extent, the sort of dichotomy between apprenticeship on the one hand and higher education on the other hand is something that we're kind of working to break down. And the other kind of bit of the diversity piece, well, sorry, maybe the other thing is the broadening out of apprenticeship into new sectors should also offer opportunities for people who do a whole range of different subjects in school, have a range of different interests, to get involved in the apprenticeship system. Like we know, I mean, and I've spoken to young apprentices, and female apprentices will tell you, well, the opportunities for me to go into apprenticeship, apart from the kind of the cultural issues and the issues around employer attitudes and all of that, but I went to an all-girls school. I didn't. I'm quoting here. and essentially it wasn't just the access to the careers information, the guidance and all of that, but actually in practical terms the subjects that I can access didn't give me access to these apprenticeship opportunities. The social mix around apprenticeship is interesting, and in lots of countries apprenticeship is something that operates at upper secondary level within schools. So you get to what would be junior cert here and you decide, am I going an academic route, am I going a vocational route? In Ireland it's different. Even in the craft apprenticeships, over 70% of entrants have completed the leaving cert. So we're not. It isn't a choice that people tend to make. Sort of midway through their second level schooling. I don't have figures, actually, Senator Ruan, and I think it would be a useful exercise. We've lots of kind of markers around educational achievement before people enter apprenticeship that kind of you could make certain inferences around social background from them. Unfortunately, you can make some of those inferences, but there's certainly the broadening out of the range of apprenticeship opportunities is intended for to give people both who enter apprenticeship a broader range of opportunities to move onwards, but also to make apprenticeship available to a much broader range of people. That's not to say that we just deal with things like female participation in apprenticeship by saying, look, we'll have apprenticeships in areas that have much higher rates of female employment. There is a job to be done in respect of the craft apprenticeships as well, and around young women seeing themselves as having roles in the construction industry, in engineering, in motor, and all of that. And the Generation Apprenticeship campaign is really tries to push those kind of female role models. And I often think that if you're a female apprentice in motor mechanics or engineering, the system leans quite heavily on you in terms of you're as a role model to speak about your experience, to give to give advice and direction to others. The other thing is apprenticeship is complex in terms of growing the numbers. There are no apprenticeships without employers taking people on. So you have a two-pronged issue in terms of generating interest for people to enter apprenticeships, but also getting employers to engage. And some of the incentive issues around employers are very relevant. And different apprenticeships have different experiences. There are some of the new apprenticeships in particular where we have loads of people who would be interested in taking on who would be interested in getting involved in those apprenticeships, but are struggling to get enough places with employers. And there are other apprenticeships where there's lots of employer interest and less interest in terms of potential apprentices and learners, and it varies across apprenticeships. But obviously, in relation to places in higher education, once they're funded, and obviously with the significant efforts made by higher education institutions as well, places can grow. Growing places in apprenticeship is more complex because it's employers who recruit. But there's a very good point, I think, being raised by Senator Funchion, where that question about visibility of opportunities. A lot of apprenticeship recruitment and regrettably is never seen by potential learners. Employers, they employ people in the way that they employ people more generally. Some of it happens through word of mouth, and obviously, terms like social capital and stuff like that becomes important. Then, the people you're aware of. The pathways to apprenticeship work proposes a number of approaches to deal with that, including having a kind of an apprenticeship marketplace where those opportunities are more clearly visible. And Solas are working on that now, and that would also help give the Intrio offices and the Social Welfare Service better visibility of apprenticeship opportunities than they have currently. as a Department of Education, we do meet with the Department of Employment and Social Protection around a range of issues in terms of participation in people in education and training, people who are unemployed and people who are on a range of other payments, whether it's single parents or people with disabilities and various other groups. And we certainly, advocate very heavily for, longer term, interventions around, apprenticeship, things like that make real differences in people in people's lives. But there are other people obviously who have significant skills, and shorter interventions may be more appropriate there. Sorry, I don't want to. Sorry, Senator Funchion, as well. The other thing I suppose about apprenticeship is, and maybe the intersection between apprenticeship and some of the supports that are mentioned. I mean, apprentices are paid, and their employees, they're not always paid a lot, and so that's absolutely absolutely recognised. But they're in a slightly different position, perhaps, than they're a slightly different position, perhaps, than, let's say, somebody who comes straight from school and has no income, and whatever. They are being paid by their employers. Nonetheless, there are very practical issues, and there are probably broader issues around taking up of employment by people in particular situations. And you mentioned childcare and all of that, and I think the affordable childcare scheme is really intended to kind of enable, if women with caring responsibilities want to become involved in the labour market, to support them into employment. And obviously, one of the types of employment we're talking about is apprenticeship. And the final, and just maybe to say, yeah, community education. Well, the first thing, community education, really important means of bringing people into all sorts of education and training opportunities. Full-time type programs, certified learning, into full-time further education and training programs, onwards into higher education, and of course into apprenticeship. Typically, people on community education, I'm more than willing to engage separately, but typically people on community education wouldn't be in a position where they would need to pay fees. So but if there are examples or anything that I'd be more than happy to engage on that. I know that there is sometimes an issue around the providers themselves, talking about, for example, the cost of accessing certification and the fees that are involved in them becoming registered with QQI and things of that nature. But
okay, thank you, Phil. And any additional information you wish to send on to the witnesses can do through the committee. Brendan?
Chair, thank you. Just, I suppose, a number of the issues that have been raised, to my mind, is really about saying, look, where are the opportunities to make further progress? And I don't think you can answer that without getting into some of the granularity, because there's different issues in different sectors and different regions. But just to rise it up a little, one level, maybe to say the following, that we really have to get, I think, on top of the challenge that's immediately ahead, because as I said in my opening statement, this future of jobs agenda is not actually a future issue, it is today. We're thankfully heading for full employment. We know that we're only going to be able to add somewhere between 15 to 20,000 people at working age in terms of the population, and that means that employers are going to be under a lot of pressure to say, where are we going to find new skills and the talent? Yes, we can do what we can around net immigration and so on, and that obviously is happening already. But the real issue is, how do we improve the productivity of the economy to contribute to economic growth, to sustain jobs and lifestyles for people? How do you do that? One key instrument of that is boosting the skill set that we have in our working population. Now, below that, what we're seeing is a lot of innovation happening, and one of the things that we're very committed to in SkillNet Ireland is working with enterprise, because the key question was asked, how do we get enterprise engaged? One of the key issues is working with them very strongly about issues of workforce planning, development, and bringing innovation to helping them solve some of those talent problems and creating opportunity for workers to develop. The question was asked, I think, by Senator Gallagher about issues too about female participation. And just to give you one very simple example, in the ICT sector, where companies are crying out for skills and for people to come and work. There's been an issue about, for example, the level of female participation, with women understandably stepping out of their career, maybe to raise a family for a number of years and do other things. And through, for example, Technology Ireland, a programme has been put in place called Women Reboot, which is really about reconnecting with women who had previously been working in the sector, maybe had taken time out because of the pace of change in the sector, had lost touch with what was happening and the skills and so on. And now we have 20 of the largest technology companies in Ireland participating in that, getting those women back into that particular sector and re-equipping them in terms of reskilling, building their confidence, getting them up to speed with the skills, and that's been a huge success. Now, that's granular. It's only one small example, but it's the kind of thing that you have to do to sort of build the sort of responses. Incentivisation was asked. The question was asked by Senator Gallagher, and that's a real issue, I think, too, around how do we get enterprise more involved. It's a really big issue, I think, amongst SMEs, where we're primarily focused in terms of the challenge. And the reason that's important at a macro level is that we're recognising that there's a huge productivity deficit challenge, and that's being masked by what's happening, particularly maybe in the multinational sector, where at superficial level you say, well, look, our productivity numbers are looking pretty good, but when you strip out the performance of the multinational sector, what you're actually seeing is it's pretty low relative, particularly amongst the SME sector. That tends to be in the harder to reach areas like parts of construction, domestic services, hospitality and so on. And those sectors, in our view, requires a greater level of incentivisation to get the employers more committed to the sort of tasks that we're talking about here in terms of participation in workforce training pretty much at all levels. And what I would say is this, that look, to my mind, it's about saying we need a number of key things happening at the one time. We need a greater incentivisation and sound systems of in-company lifelong learning. We know we're at about 8.5% levels of participation, generally speaking, and we know that the policy commitment is to double that to about 15%. That's welcome, but again, it's about accelerating that. But we also need, right throughout the education and training system at all levels, to inculcate a culture of agile learning on the part of workers, and obviously the systems that we bring, including policy delivery and service support, has to be about preparing for, as I would term it, the repurposing of skills and training. Because remember this, and it's available to yourselves, just look at what the World Economic Forum is saying. By 2022, only a short number of years away, somewhere of the order of 54% of all workers will have to have some level of reskilling or upskilling. That is one hell of a challenge, and we need to be ahead of that in the competition for inward investment around job sustainability and sustaining our regions, where many of our SMEs are most importantly located around the country in terms of sustaining jobs outside of the major urban centres. And that's where we believe, certainly we have a significant role to play in that because of our strong reach to every region and every sector, but we have more to do.
Okay, thank you. Jim, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to touch on one of the issues that Senator Ruan and Senator Gallagher both raised in different ways. And I suppose one way of terming it is that it's the Cinderella status of apprenticeship, and it's not an easy thing to address. I mean, the status of an education and training programme and how it's perceived socially is deeply embedded within the psyche. So it is a real cultural challenge that we have to actually take on. In terms of how we go about it, I mean, I think there are two ways we should approach it. First of all, we have to neutralise the term. And Phil touched on it to a certain degree. It has to be perceived more as a mode of provision rather than something that has a whole set of social values attached to it, whether they're wrong, right, or whatever is the case. We also then need to mainstream it as a mode of provision. And that means it needs to be much more visible within what we might call, for want of a better term, the regular system, particularly in higher education. And the new apprenticeships have begun that task by putting apprenticeship right in at the heart of higher education. It is still a small beginning, but there are now available degree programmes which are in the apprenticeship mode of provision. And we have to keep working on that. We have to make it much more visible, and hopefully then over time that attitudinal change will occur. But it is a very substantial challenge, and I think that, you know, as Senator Gallagher mentioned, the numbers are stark, and there are reasons for that. But I think with the new apprenticeships we have opened up that discussion in a way that has never been done previously, but we have to sustain it over the long term to make that change.
Thank you. And I move to Mary Liz Trant, please, for your response.
Thank you, Chair. And just a couple of points just to follow on the contributions just so far. I suppose just we talked about employers, and that comes through, I think, very clearly on just the role of employers. The Council has been engaging with employers involved in the new apprenticeships to talk about how things are going, and you know, and the rollout. And part of what's emerged is where you have apprenticeships where there's been a huge amount of employers who went through the apprenticeship route. There are huge champions, and you know, the Deputy mentioned, you know, Martin McVicker, for example, who obviously went through the apprenticeship route, understands and is hugely committed to this as a way of learning, as a way of having that pipeline of talent. In the newer apprenticeships, you know, finance and you know, even the ICT areas, a lot of employers have never really engaged with apprenticeship before, and that's a big piece of work that we're doing to kind of, I suppose, to engage, to get that kind of buy-in, because you know that's very influential. And the other part is the voices and the experiences of apprentices themselves. So we have, you know, we've got the first graduates have come through from the first apprenticeship programs. We'll have more next year. We have, you know, that social kind of, you know, spread of people who are buying into, who want apprenticeship opportunities, is starting to shift, but there's a lot more to do. And part of the Generation Apprenticeship campaign, it's about changing that narrative. That's at the heart of that messaging, which is apprenticeship actually, it's a mode of learning, it's a choice, and we have to promote that. Just to go back briefly to Senator Rowan's point, we have, through the Pathways Review, we gathered as much as we could on the kind of the social, you know, the background, the profile of apprentices. We know 85% are men under 25 years of age, 2.8% declared a disability, just 2% are women. Interestingly, one of the new apprenticeships has more women than men, but the majority of the traditional ones has, like, you know, a tiny or even no women at all. So we have some of that information, but we do, and in the Pathways Review, we commit to getting more on that and to building that picture and that understanding, and that's really important. Just one small point that Deputy Funchion raised, you know, the barbering and hairdressing. We have an apprenticeship in development in that, and a huge amount that's actually planned for rollout next year. That will include hairdressing and barbering, and we know that the industry is really enthused and excited about this as a structured way of actually getting opportunities, I suppose, for people who want to get into the industry, and also a way of earning and learning as we go. And then the final point is, and Phil mentioned it, it's about, I suppose, part of that overall picture of awareness. We have this, we're working on what we're calling a jobs market, where employers are going to be able to advertise their vacancies. It'll be available on apprenticeship.ie, and so Department of Social Protection, schools, guidance counsellors and employers themselves will be able to provide that level of visibility of apprenticeship opportunities. So where there are employers finding it difficult to find apprentices, or apprentices are not hearing about the opportunities, we'll be able to really improve that. That's a piece of work that we're working on right now. We're hoping to pilot it by the end of the year with a number of employers and then roll it out in 2019. So we think that's going to be really, you know, quite significant as part of that awareness piece.
Thank you, Mary Liz. Good to see that some more women are getting involved, because as a committee it did concern us when we saw the statistics for last year that only 2% of the apprenticeships were taken up by women. So we certainly hope that that will continue on in a positive way. I want to thank Deputy Martin for standing in for me while I was on other Dáil business. Very much appreciated. I'm now going to go to Senator Byrne. I'm sure she'll be back down. Deputy Martin, over to yourself then.
Thank you very much, and thank you for presentations. I note Waterford Wexford ETB are developing an NZEB, Nearly Zero Energy Building Sector of Excellence, and Limerick Institute of Technology have worked with them to develop the training content for that programme that upskills electricians and plumbers and blocklayers and others. Although the WWETB have to, it's terrible, they have to fight for the money despite the work they're doing as the wave of the future, and fundamentally necessary if we really are to address fuel poverty and improve our energy security. So while you have started new apprenticeships in auctioneering and property services, what actions are you taking to create apprenticeships in areas that improve the quality of the houses being auctioned, rented or sold? Because currently building standards are still quite, under-regulated, under-inspected, but the, self-certification is there, and there is a severe lack of trained professionals to do the work required. And I know that many of the people that work on renovation and retrofitting and energy efficiency on these new green areas, our new economy, have not been trained in Ireland, and they have to go elsewhere for that expertise. So what is Sullus doing at a regional level to upskill and support the retrofit sector through and what is your policy in this area? Have you started to build on the pioneering work of Waterford Wexford ETB on retrofitting, especially considering the requirement of current and incoming EU energy efficiency and NZ targets? I note that the action plan to expand apprenticeship and traineeship in Ireland 2016-2020 includes targets to have 67 apprenticeship programmes in place by the end of 2020 in new industry areas. That's a clear upward trend, but are we preparing these apprentices for the reality of our changing economy and where we need to go? And of the 120 million that has been allocated for apprenticeship in 2018 and 34.6 for traineeships 2020, can I ask for the breakdown of how much has been invested into climate mitigation or adaptation, such as energy efficiency, as compared to investment in fossil fuel employment? I believe there's talk of the European Social Fund, which currently funds the new apprenticeships traineeship fund, being used to upskill the fossil fuel workers in Germany and the Czech Republic. And has the department approached anyone at EU level or prepared any draft plans for the Midlands in respect of such funding opportunities? In relation to the gender balance, I'm glad to see moves in the right direction, but your sort of submission does state it's still 1% of apprenticeships are women. So I'm glad to hear that there's a move to encourage them to beyond certain areas that clearly where they're quite saturated markets, and indeed vulnerable to cyclical dips in the economy, such as beauty therapists and hairdressers. And of course, care work is also an industry with very bad, poor conditions and pay. So is there, for an example, an Athena Swan award equivalent for institutions and businesses in this area? And can I also ask what departmental actions are being taken in light of the fact that just 2.75% of apprentices declare a disability? And also, is there an apprenticeship expo, and could this become a compulsory part of the transition year schools programme? Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Martin. I'll move on to Senator Byrne.
My apologies, I had to go up for quorum duty, so if I ask any questions that were asked already, okay, I do apologise. But certainly just to thank the four witnesses for their very informative presentations. Just to follow up on something actually that Deputy Martin said there about an apprenticeship expo. I know that in the Midwest that they ran an apprenticeship day recently where they actually provided free buses which collected students from schools, brought them to the expo, and I must say it was a really, really successful day, and parents as well turned up, which I thought was you know, good, because they turned up with the students to find out about the different apprenticeships. I have to say that I educated myself on some of the apprenticeships that I didn't even realise that were there. Like, for example, I didn't realise there was an apprenticeship in things like refrigeration and that, which I wouldn't have thought about before. I'd like to compliment the fact that apprenticeships are growing, because I'm a big fan of that whole area myself, especially in terms of the fact that, I suppose, third level education isn't for everybody. There are many of the apprenticeships now that have been awarded. I know the QQI level, but also some of them are being tied in with the ITs and the universities where they can have a, we'll say, a cert diploma degree level. How many of them are they all being accredited, or is it just some? Number two is the fact that this expo was such, I suppose, a success. Is it going to be repeated in the other areas? I know that this is the second or third year that it was run by the Midwest, and I'd like to pay a tribute to the Joe Ledden, the Regional Skills person who actually put the whole project together, because it was great to bring both employers and the apprenticeships together. And that ties in with, I suppose, a question that was asked earlier. Is there a lot of collaboration between employers and the actual apprenticeships? And also, I know that I was speaking with some hairdressers recently, and they take on many apprentices, and they have to pay their different fees, but they receive no incentive or no maybe tax relief or whatever. If that's an area that could be looked at, that the employer be incentivised in terms of they taking on the apprentice, giving them their upskilling, their uptraining, but that the employer should receive something at the other end in terms of, you know, investing in the employee of the future. Because some of them take on many employees or many apprentices and give them the training. So I do think it's important that there be a bit of balance in both. And just in relation to the 35, I think it is, that you mentioned other programmes that are in development. Could we just get a broad outline as to what else is being proposed? Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Deputy O'Sullivan.
Thank you very much, Chair. And could I just welcome you all? I'm delighted to see so much progress in relation to the new apprenticeships in particular. Obviously, I worked with some of you in the establishment of the Apprenticeship Council, and I think it's very welcome that there's 67 now due, I think, by 2020. And my apologies for being late. I had a conflicting meeting. So just, I suppose, put that on the record first of all, because I think there's been really good work done. I think the challenge now, though, is to get the message out as broadly as possible, because what we need is we need the employers and we need the apprentices, obviously, to fish the opportunities that are there. I'd like to join with Maria in congratulating the Regional Skills Organiser in Limerick, Joe Ledden, on organising that apprenticeship forum, which really gave an opportunity. But he's one of, I think, 8 regional skills organisers around the country, so I think it's a model that should be followed up around in other places, and you might just let me know if that is the plan. So I suppose the main focus I want to put on is really on getting the message out, and somebody mentioned the Generation Apprenticeship campaign. So maybe just to get some update on how widespread, you know, the campaigning is. Like, is it in social media? I think is crucial in terms of interesting young people. So you know, whether there needs to be maybe an invigoration of the presence on social media, just to make sure young people know about it. Also local media, I think, for parents in particular. I mean, I don't know whether anybody can do anything about the way league tables are done in newspapers, but if you could include apprenticeships as well as going to higher education, then that would, I think, make a difference in terms of perception, because I just find it quite disgusting to read that such and such a school is the best in the country because it has 100% attendance higher education or for whatever, when there are other equally valid opportunities that are just completely brushed under the carpet in terms of the excellence of those schools. So maybe it would be worth contacting the media, the newspapers that publish these league tables, and say, look, these should be included. I don't know what your views are on that, or whether you would have a role in doing that. Maybe we would as a committee. Maybe something we could do. And just my final issue is following up again on what people have said about, and particularly Deputy Martin, around the green, I suppose, green building and the European Social Fund and the Midlands, whether the Youth Guarantee is another one of those European concepts that should capture young people who end up going to the Department of Employment and Social Protection instead of the people that Deputy Funchion talked about, who really should be guided towards these opportunities which are meant to be covered under the Youth Guarantee. And just on the Midlands, it just struck me when you were talking about the displacement of peat and so on, whether the Globalisation Fund, again, I think Phil might have some knowledge of the Globalisation Fund, whether there's funding there as well to possibly direct people into alternative opportunities who may have been involved in fossil fuels, etc. So,
thank you. Thank you very much, Deputy. I have a few questions myself, and I apologise that I didn't get to hear the full presentation, but I will have the opportunity to look back and to look at the transcripts. And I did obviously have an opportunity to read the submissions prior to the meeting. So the questions that I would have, firstly, I know you were talking about the 1967 legislation being over 50 years old, and that just wondering, is there a need to examine the legislation and to consolidate the acts to make the process more efficient? If that's something that's helpful, again, that might be something that we could look at as a committee, certainly. It strikes me that engagement with career guidance teachers is really, really important. And are there sufficient numbers of career guidance teachers really to enable that? Because it would appear that apprenticeships do suffer from a lack of parity of esteem. And I think that's an issue that we all have to address, particularly among our younger people who are getting ready to leave school. And definitely the career guidance teacher has a big role in relation to that. Maybe you could give us a little bit more information about the promotion of traineeships as opposed to apprenticeships, because that's another important area as well. There is a proposal by government to increase the National Training Fund between now and 2020. In your experience, because you're liaising with industry, are the industries supportive of that? Again, just in relation to going back to the issue about women taking up apprenticeships, that women traditionally tend to avail of flexible working arrangements, and I'm just wondering, are there training courses that are offered in a similar manner that might be able to help support that? I know that the department said in their submissions that traineeships in the past were primarily associated with unemployed people, but as unemployment levels have dropped, this obviously has impacted on the uptake. So has this resulted in a drive towards attracting second level to that? And also in terms of people that are, say, unemployed, and if they are in an older age bracket, people who've taken redundancies, and I gather you've been talking about the issue about Bordnamona in the Midlands. So taking, for example, areas where there will be a cohort of people possibly in their late 40s, early 50s, is there a difference in those type of courses? Because we need to be able to attract these people to go to different types of classes to make sure that they are employable for another job, because they're only midway through their working lives. That's pretty much it. Just a final question. Do you think that some form of positive discrimination could be applied to apprenticeships and traineeships to encourage a greater uptake? And by that, I mean possible tax breaks for employers or indeed employees if people have been on benefits that they would retain, say a medical card, etc. Do you think that would be something that would help? So thank you, and I'll go back now to the panel to respond to myself and the other members. Okay, Phil.
I'll just kick off and Thanks very much for the contributions. There's plenty of food for thought in them for us also. I might leave it to Solis to comment a bit on the promotion agenda and the expos and all of that. But there's a major event coming up in the spring of next year where we're bringing together the world's. People may be aware of the World Skills. It's like Skills Olympics almost. Well, the national version of that basically is used to determine who goes forward to the World Skills. That's being brought together with a major expo in the RDS, in the RDS in March, in order to kind of really anchor the apprenticeship piece and to promote excellence and all of that. But there's more to be said about promotion. But I'll leave it to I'll leave it maybe to Mary Liz to give some more details around that. The ESF is an interesting one, and without maybe being too technical, in the short space of time we have, ESF funding is the total amount of ESF funding is kind of determined at the outset of the programming period at EU level, and is set for the various member states, which essentially makes it part of the overall budgetary planning. It's not that you can kind of get additional resources from the EU for specific things. It all has to come from your overall ESF budget. Now, of course, the question of what is included within our operational programmes is an important one, and further education and training is a major part of ESF supported opportunities. Where there is, and as Deputy O'Sullivan has raised, where there is some opportunities for specific kind of additional interventions is through the European Globalisation Fund. I actually don't know the answer to the question of is it being deployed in the case of the Byrne workers or the decarbonisation agenda more generally, and the impact that has on the economy. But I'll certainly check with colleagues if that's part of the. People would be aware of various major interventions in terms of EGF, and it isn't always for one particular company. It was done, for example, in terms of the downturn in the construction industry on a broader basis. But I'll certainly check the position with that, and I'll come back to the committee with information around it. The question about new building techniques and retrofitting, and there's activity in terms of the content of apprenticeship programmes, and people will be aware there were 27 craft apprenticeships, and all of the curricula have been reviewed in those apprenticeships to look at new building techniques, new building regulations indeed, and how that impacts on the various trades. And it was a fairly significant part of the curriculum review to ensure that those different types of techniques are included. There are also a range of non-apprenticeship programmes, but education and training programmes, specifically in areas of retrofitting, and I don't have the volume in front of me in terms of how much of the overall further education and training budget is going towards those programs, but they do exist, and again we can get some additional information around that. And as Deputy Martin mentions, I'm aware of the specific case or the specific provision that's being put together by WWETB, Waterford Wexford ETB, in that space, and hopefully that provides an exemplar for other parts of the country as well. The incentives question, and one thing, and maybe it goes to Deputy Funchion's question about barbering a little as well earlier on. There are some things that out in the kind of common parlance are called apprenticeships, but aren't necessarily statutory apprenticeships. So the flow of state funding and resources to those sorts of programs just isn't the same. So we have people who would be called apprentice, bar persons or apprentice barbers and all of that, but actually they're not. It's not state funded, and they don't form part of the statutory programme. And as Mary Liz said, barbering and hairdressing is coming into that fold through a specific proposal, and there's a programme being developed. But where programmes aren't within the statutory function, not only are they not getting the same state supports, but they're actually the employees aren't getting the same levels of protections that are available to apprentices under the statutory system as well. So but that may have something to do with the difficulty that people have in engaging some of those programs. I'll just mention league tables. Deputy O'Sullivan, be aware this is a very contentious issue. The league tables aren't supplied by the department to them. They're collated by media organisations through information that's put out through the CAO and other sources. However, I am aware that Solas has been making a conscious effort, I mean very broadly in terms of further education and training, but also a little bit in this specific area, the question of how apprenticeship features in that as a mark of success. Now, going to Jim's point, there's a danger that high levels of conversion into apprenticeship because of some of the public reception is not necessarily seen as a positive thing. Something I would disagree with hugely, but that's all of that plays into the picture. We are looking at, Chair, we're looking at some sort of positive discriminations. This document, the review of pathways to apprenticeship, talks about there is a bursary for recruiting female apprentices in the craft sectors. We're looking to extend it into other sectors as well. We need to engage with some of our other government colleagues, Department of Public Expenditure Reform, etc., in order to get agreement around that. We're looking to extend that into some of the new areas, but we're also looking to extend it to people with disabilities. So that's another part. The 1967 legislation, and indeed the statutory framework for apprenticeship as a whole, we are now gathering information, and indeed, I'm aware. Obviously, the committee is also gathering information. They're gathering information from employers around their experience of engaging with the apprenticeship programme, and where there are sort of, let's say, specific issues that may need some sort of attention from a statutory perspective. We'll certainly consider that. There isn't a formal proposal at this stage to change, and it is a complex area. So some of the things that people might talk about as being, let's say, bureaucratic, do offer kind of protection to apprenticeship in terms of the quality of the education and training that they receive, and it's important that agenda is fully protected. Our industry supportive of the National Training Fund increase. Obviously, there was a formal consultation process around that. Employers obviously said, look, we're in times of uncertainty, Brexit and various issues, don't necessarily need additional costs in relation to employment. But we have walked a journey with employers around that. There is there was a review of the National Training Fund, 14 recommendations around, greater employer say in terms of how the funding is allocated, what the priorities should be, and a range of other things around evaluation. And an implementation plan for those was published alongside Budget 2019, and there will be an advisory group set up involving employers as well. So I think there is a recognition that there is greater funding coming from employers, and with that comes some obligations around influence.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate that. I'm just conscious that others have indicated as well. Brendan.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just just very briefly, again, I suppose around issues, for example, about promotion, and certainly our experience, and I absolutely accept the point that Deputy O'Sullivan makes about the importance of connecting locally. And certainly in our experience in Skillnet Ireland, that capacity to engage locally through social media, through all the various channels, is hugely important, and obviously the connection then maybe through local media. So again, I think we've had some really valuable experience about what works and what doesn't, and happy maybe to share that. Could I also just say about the point that was made about the importance, Chair, yourself, about the question about women being offered training in terms of the flexibility of options, hugely important. And I think, to be fair, our experience is that employers are much more sensitive to that, are connecting with it, not least because obviously they have this huge challenge where they're trying to attract people into their businesses. Obviously, people are also now, testing the employer to see, well, look, what are the career mobility options that are being presented if I go to that particular employer? So part of that is, in fact, how the training approach is actually being done. So what we're actually seeing is that there's a much greater willingness to look at more flexible, modular, part-time evening programs of one form or another. And then again, just an interesting experience that we've had in a sector, for example, as big as retail, right, where, back in the day, this might be a bit unfair, but maybe parts of retailing might be associated with, well, you're working in retail, well, that's just a job in a shop. It's not a job in a shop, and employers have grasped that issue, and through the work that has been done with ourselves, there is now a very active presentation of a full career in retailing, whereby not only can people, and it might happen to be in the profile from a gender point of view predominantly women, but nonetheless people are getting access and having prior learning recognised, and working with the qualification bodies, making sure that that is done in a systematic way, so that people who maybe didn't have their leaving cert, who maybe worked in a retail environment maybe for 5 or 10 years, could have that experience recognised as a stepping stone towards something else and progression. Whereby now, people, yes, they can have their skill sets properly recognised and certified, up to allowing for career progression, whereby they can now have a degree in retail management practice at level 7 in the qualifications framework. Now, that's hugely powerful and impactful. But from a business perspective, it's very important, because you're attracting somebody into the sector, you're giving them an opportunity to see ahead, to say, well, where do I go to next? And you're retaining them within the sector. So those are the sort of practical issues that we have to deal with. The question was also asked, well, what's happening about sort of the cohort of people maybe in their 40s and 50s and so on. And absolutely, and that's a hugely important issue. We've had that experience, not least obviously of what happened when the construction sector collapsed, and the challenges that were presented in terms of cross-skilling and getting people retrained in new sectors and areas of green energy and sustainability and all of that. But even around, for example, where we've had the unfortunate experience of closures, we've been heavily involved in supporting workers that have been impacted in places, like, for example, just to name a few, like Cotty and Tipperary, Hewlett-Packard and Kildare, Talk and Waterford, Cameron and Longford and so on. And you have to have a response that caters for those particular requirements, and that has worked. But it's about tailoring the response, it's about agility of that response, and working collaboratively with other agencies, and we've been able to bring that very much to the focus of the task in hand.
Right. Thank you. Jim.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of brief points. I think Senator Byrne had a query around accreditation of apprenticeships in the higher education institutions. Just to say that there are statutory quality assurance guidelines that all providers of apprenticeship have to adhere to, and they then would be operated through the awarding bodies, and the higher education institutions for apprenticeships at level 6 to 10 would be the accrediting bodies in those instances, but operating under national guidelines. Just in terms of the legislation, I suppose the issue really is around the policies and processes that flow out of multiple sets of legislation, and that's where work amongst the agencies and the providers over time can work at streamlining those processes. But it is something that is necessary because it does actually help to break the log jam in terms of the throughput of programmes coming through the system. And then just briefly on the gender and access issue, a very interesting idea from Deputy Martin on having a Tina Swan for apprenticeship, and maybe it's something that in due course we'll be able to look at. But on the gender issue more broadly and on access more broadly, as well as the system level activities that Phil and Mary Liz have articulated, there is also institutional on the ground efforts as well. I mean, I know DIT during the course of the year, they've actually have a new programme called Access to Apprenticeship. It's run in 3 cycles over 12 weeks, and they would bring in a lot of young kids to sample apprenticeship, the different types of apprenticeship, from socially and economically deprived areas, and that is a very successful way of bringing people into the system. And they've also targeted a number of they've had an open day specifically targeted towards women. So there are a lot of local initiatives as well complementing the central efforts.
Thank you, Jim. Mary Liz.
And just to pick up on a number of the points, and just maybe following on, Chair and members, from Jim, I suppose the local and the regional element of all what we're doing is hugely important. You know, we've got 16 education and training boards, 14 institutes of technology, we've got more universities as well, we've got all of the employers, and a big part of the Generation Apprenticeship competition has been about co-opting everybody in that. And you know, we have that reach into local and regional, and Senator Byrne talked about, you know, what's happening in the Midwest. We have all these structures around the country now. They're hugely powerful and effective, and you know, I suppose they're making a very big contribution. What we're doing at the centre and supporting and facilitating Generation Apprenticeship, we have apprenticeship.ie, for example, and we're, you know, I suppose that's the one-stop shop. What we're working on is to make that so that's the profile, you know, that's where the jobs market will be, the link to it, and we have a big social media presence that, you know, well, it's getting bigger, we've more to do on it, but we have about 25,000 visitors to apprenticeship.ie each month. We're there on LinkedIn, on Twitter, on Facebook. We're looking at how to reach some of, you know, the mid-20s men, the school leavers, the transition years. What are the ways in which we reach these you know, groups, and then also employers, you know, because again, not forgetting the role of employers in all of this. And some of you may have heard, DSB, for example, just got a recent award as part of European Skills Week for their work in apprenticeship, and also including their work with attracting women into the electrical apprenticeship, which is again traditionally one of the areas where it's been predominantly men. They've done a huge amount in promoting opportunities, and you know, and they've more than, you know, I think they've about 16 female apprentices now, where maybe 2 or 3 years ago they had 1 or 2. You know, those single-digit figures. So they're showing the way as an employer about what can be done. On traineeship, Deputy, you were asking just about how we're promoting traineeship. We're working very closely with the education training boards all around the country. You know, there's that very exciting pipeline now of 51 traineeships on offer, and we're supporting nationally in terms of, you know, the branding, opportunities for workshops, engaging with employers, working with the regional skills fora, but hand in hand with the education training boards and their connections with employers. Just, I suppose, Senator Byrne asked about the pipeline, what's coming. So the detail list is there, but it includes sales, it includes retail. There's 4 more in the area of ICT. We've got there'll be 4 chef apprenticeships by middle of next year. We've 2 already. Supply chain, logistics, so important for Brexit. We've got farm apprenticeships and horticulture and engineering. So there's a whole range, and part of what the council is doing is looking at how do we keep making sure that apprenticeship is responding. So what we already have, but also what we need in the future. Deputy Martin talked about, you know, what's happening on climate change. We're working very closely with the CIF on an ongoing basis and other partners, just to make sure that not only are the existing apprenticeships have the content to make sure that we're responding to those those imperatives and the regulations and so on, but also that if there are new areas that we need to build in or new apprenticeships, that we have a way to actually do that. And the council is piloting a kind of an engagement with employers and with other bodies at the moment, just to make sure that I suppose they have their finger on the pulse on that. And just a final point, just Deputy McLoughlin, on the lifelong learning element and opportunities for existing employees or employees who are at risk of losing their jobs. Apprenticeship is increasingly becoming an opportunity for people in employment as well. We know from the insurance apprenticeship, we know from the engineering ones, up to half of the first intakes were actually existing employees who maybe were 5 or 10 years in work, never had got a formal qualification, and they were being facilitated by their employer to complete the apprenticeship, to continue as employees, but to move on to the apprenticeship, complete it, and then take up potentially new positions, more senior positions in their companies. So I suppose increasingly, obviously apprenticeship is a hugely important route for young people, but also it's for learners of all ages and backgrounds, and we're already seeing that really taking off with the new apprenticeships, and I think hopefully we'll see more of that as time goes on.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Riley. Catherine, you want to supplement?
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I think I asked there of the 120 million that's been allocated for apprenticeship in 2018 and the 34.6 for traineeships. Is there a breakdown of how much is invested into climate mitigation or adaptation, such as energy efficiency? And the other one is just on that. The retrofits sector, and on working on the work from WWETB, what is the exact policy? Is it something way in the future? Because that's not where we need to be. We need to be in the here and now. Is there a time frame that you have on building on that pioneering work of the WWETB? What is the plan, and when is it going to be implemented? We need people. The Irish Green Building Council said they're not being trained in Ireland, and it's appalling. This is the new green economy, and if we're looking especially to the Midlands, we need to be retraining and upskilling. So just what is the plan there? Thanks.
So first, just on the first question, Deputy Martin, I suppose in terms of a breakdown of what's been spent, we've got, I suppose we haven't got available figures on specifics on that, but what we can do is, I suppose, is looking at those apprenticeships, for example, that are in that area of construction, where there are dimensions of where the curriculum now includes those elements, and I suppose, what's being allocated for those apprenticeships. But we can certainly come back and look at that and just see what further information can be provided.
Thank you.
We're very supportive of the work in Waterford and Wexford and ETB, and previously with Limerick Institute of Technology. I don't have immediate information just on, I suppose, what the overall plan is, but again, we can come back to the committee on that just with further information.
Thank you. Yeah, we're always open to getting further information. Just to make a point, Phil, you were talking about the apprenticeship skills in March, which is a super idea. We were very impressed as a committee when we had the apprenticeships that were representing Ireland, but I'd say the committee would like to visit that if it's possible. So you might just let us know about it. And then secondly, just in terms of the retail, I couldn't agree more. I think showing a pathway through retail is really important. And we see that two of the latest entrants into the whole grocery marketing, they have a really good pathway and graduate programme, and I think it certainly adds to attracting people in that area. But look, it's been a very interesting morning, a very engaging morning. We will be resuming our examining of this on the 20th of November. Next Tuesday we're going to have another 4 different groups coming in. But we really appreciate your time and your engagement, and if you feel there is anything else that you would like to send us in before we send our report in, please do. So I want to thank the members. We will be adjourning for 3 minutes to go into the next part of the agenda and our engagement with Karen Nua. Thank you. So this meeting is now suspended for 3 minutes. And item number 5 on our agenda. There we are. Item number 5 on our agenda is engagement with the department officials re Carranua. So the purpose of this part of the meeting is to have an engagement with officials from the Department of Education and Skills in relation to the operation of Carranua, the state agency under the aegis of the department responsible for the administration of the Residential Institution Statutory Fund. On behalf of the committee, I wish to welcome Mr Ned Costello, Assistant Secretary-General with the Department of Education and Skills, Ms Catherine Hines, Principal Officer of the Department of Education and Skills, and Mr Angus O'Hingasa, Assistant Principal Officer in the Department of Education and Skills. The format of this part of the meeting is that I will invite our stakeholders to make a brief opening statement, maximum of 3 minutes, which will be followed by an engagement with members of the committee. Before we begin, I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. However, if you are directed by myself as Chair to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I also wish to advise you that any opening statements you've made to the committee will be published on the committee website after this meeting. And members, of course, are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. So I would now like to call on Ned Costello to make an opening statement on behalf of the Department of Education and Skills.
Thank you, Chair, and I thank the committee on my own behalf and behalf of my colleagues for giving the Department the opportunity to come before it today to discuss issues relating to Carranua and the needs of survivors of abuse, including the long-term supports that may be available to survivors into the future. Today's meeting follows previous engagements with the Chair of Carranua and the then Chief Executive last year, and more recent meetings with 2 former board members of the board of Carranua. In relation to the role of the Department and the historical background, it might be useful if at the outset I summarise the Department's role in relation to supporting survivors. This role extends back many years, and it arose from the fact that historically the Department had a statutory role in relation to the operation of the industrial schools and reformatories. Thankfully, those institutions are no longer in existence. When the issue of abuse in those institutions became the focus of public attention some 20 years ago, the Department was given the task by Government of implementing a number of measures, including the establishment of the Commission to Inquire into Child Abuse, the Residential Institutions Redress Board and the Redress Review Committee. These bodies have virtually completed their work, and we expect that they will be dissolved in the near future. There was a fourth body, the Education Finance Board, which was also in existence but which was dissolved, and in effect it was replaced in 2013 by the Residential Institutions Statutory Fund, also known as Carranua, which has a wider mandate than the Finance Board and significantly more funding available to it. In relation to the funding of Carranua, Chair, that funding derives from a commitment by the religious congregations to provide funding of 110 million for additional supports to survivors who have previously received an award from the Redress Board, an equivalent court award or settlement. And the receipt, having been in receipt of such an award, is a key criterion for applying for and receiving assistance from Carranua. As regards the funding available, to date almost 102 million has been received out of the 110, plus an additional 1.3 million in interest associated with those contributions. There is an outstanding balance, clearly, and the Christian Brothers have written to the Department to say that they expect to provide the balance of that funding by the first quarter of 2019. Carranua, under its founding legislation, is statutorily independent in carrying out its functions, and as I say, that's enshrined in its legislation. In relation to the services provided by Carranua, the Board of Carranua is responsible for strategy, policy, governance, oversight and control, with the executive of the body reporting to it. For example, the board is responsible in law for determining what services are approved services, and these must fall under 4 classes of services set out in Section 8 of the 2012 Act. The services are mental health service, a health and social personal service, an educational service, and a housing support service. The board also determines the criteria by reference to which decisions will be made on individual applications, but does not make decisions on individual applications. In the context of the 2012 Act, the Minister's role relates to matters such as the appointment of board members, the appointment of the independent appeals officer or officers, the approval of contracts and consultancies, and certain staff matters. The Minister is also responsible for managing the process of receiving the contributions from the religious congregations, and making those contributions available to Carranua via the NTMA. In relation to applications and expenditure, since Carranua began accepting applications in January 2014, it has received over 6,500 applications, and by the end of October it had expended some 78 million on supports for former residents. Some 5,000 individuals have benefited directly to date. The supports from Carranua have made a tangible difference to the lives of many people, and some of the case studies, both on the website and the recent annual report, are illustrative of this. The Department is, of course, aware that there is a degree of dissatisfaction with the quality of service provided by Carranua. And some of that dissatisfaction, we would suggest, should be seen in the context of the fact that Carranua had to be established from scratch, from a greenfield site. There wasn't a body there before doing the equivalent things. And it has to be said that there were teething troubles in the formative years of Carranua. However, ultimately, while Carranua must speak for itself on these issues as an independent agency, there is strong evidence that Carranua has and is continuing to address concerns in relation to its operations. For example, following feedback from survivors, the following services were introduced. Additional services: household goods such as cookers, fridges, floors, home decoration, contributions towards funeral costs, contributions to the costs of reconnecting with family members and home place. Some 180 people have benefited from that, and active listening to the stories of survivors. In relation to the applying for support from Carranua, each survivor is assigned an application advisor to assist them through the process of applying for services. The length of time it takes to process applications does very much depend on the specific needs of the individual survivor, and that is consistent with the person-centred approach taken by Carranua. Carranua has 2 dedicated call line operators who are the first port of call for those who contact Carranua by phone, and if a survivor does not get a response or chooses to leave a voicemail, the Carranua policy is that a callback will be made within 24 hours, and 3 attempts will be made if they don't get through to the survivor on the first instance. Of course, it is also proper that there should be a right of appeal against Carranua's decisions, and that's enshrined in the legislation, and that appeals mechanism is independent of Carranua. In regard to the structuring of the appeals mechanism, initially 1 person served in this position, but when that person stepped down in 2017, 2 appeals officers were appointed, and the Minister made those appointments cognizant of the fact that a backlog of 140 appeals cases had built up. In May of 2018, 1 of the officers stepped down for personal reasons, but however, as the matter of the backlog had been addressed, the Minister decided to revert to the original arrangement of 1 appeals officer. We understand that there are currently 45 appeals cases on hand. We are keeping the matter under close review, and we can say that if there is any question of a backlog arising again, the Minister will be thinking about appointing a second appeals officer. There's also been concerns expressed about the length of time taken to conclude appeals. However, the appeals process, to have due process done, requires that the views of all parties be sought in relation to the matters under the appeal, and as a result of that, inevitably, it does take a certain length of time for appeals to be processed. I would also like to clarify, and we're aware that there are concerns about this, that since mid-2016, applicants to Carranua whose applications are not approved are notified in writing of the right to appeal, and they are also written to and told how to go about making appeal, not simply that they can appeal, but how to appeal. We included sample letters in some of the background briefing, Chair, that we provided to the committee, along with a range of statistical information in relation to the appeals. In addition, Chair, I would note that since 2016 there has been a sharp downturn in the number of complaints in respect of Carranua, and we provided a graph of that in the additional material we submitted. Finally, Chair, coming to a conclusion, I would like to turn now to a number of policy issues that bear on the recent and future operations of Carranua. Firstly, it will be recalled that the RISF is a cash-limited fund. Any cash contributions from the congregations in excess of the 110 million that's statutorily provided for in the fund, the statute also provides that they are to go to the costs associated with the development of the National Children's Hospital. Some survivors and advocates have expressed their view that the cap of 15,000 which the Board of Carranua introduced in 2016 has resulted in an organisation that is not sufficiently responsive to the needs of survivors or sufficiently catering for them. I must stress, Chair, that the application of the limit is a decision for Carranua. However, I think it might be observed that issues relating to the equitable treatment of the cohort of survivors do arise when decisions of this nature are to be made, and the balancing of an equitable spread of assistance across the population of survivors and the fund. It might also be observed that Carranua has to strike a balance between the need to engage as flexibly and compassionately as possible with survivors, but also the fiduciary obligations and other accountabilities that rest on it. And while procedures may be seen by some as too bureaucratic, it has been necessary for the organisation to respond to the findings of the Comptroller and Auditor General in this regard. By the end of October, as I said already, Carranua has expended 87 million of the 110 million. Cognizant of the rate that this fund was being expended and the application on hands, Carranua in May 2018 did announce that it would be ceasing new applications, taking new applications, save for extreme hardship case, and set a date of the 1st of August for that. Unlike the earlier experience of the Residential Institutions Redress Board, where we saw a very large spike in applications when the board, announced a cessation date, this has not happened in the case of Carranua. And this is notwithstanding the fact that Carranua engaged in an extensive publicity campaign, including advertisements and engagements with survivor groups. Carranua is still engaging with survivors, both in respect of applications on hands, and there remains a significant volume of applications on hands, and also in its support and advocacy function, which aims to assist survivors in engaging with other state providers of supports. The objective underpinning the work of Carranua was that it would address the critical needs of former residents. Those needs were identified by former residents themselves in a consultation process undertaken in 2010, being in areas such as housing and health. Chair, and related supports. And that consultation informed the drafting of the 2012 Act. In relation to further work ongoing in the Department, we are continuing to engage on the issue of the future needs of survivors. And Chair, while I'm conscious of time, if you don't mind, I would mention 3 areas. First, we are undertaking a post hoc review of the redress scheme, the various redress schemes that have been under the aegis of the Department, including looking at relevant international experience of those schemes. And we're doing that review to both reflect on what has happened over the period that we've been providing redress, and also thinking about what we've learned and what lessons there may be for the future where issues of redress arise, not necessarily in the Department but across the whole of government. Secondly, we are planning to hold a number of consultation sessions which would serve as a forum for former residents and others with close personal involvement to reflect on their experiences on the State's response in relation to redress and the issue of institutional abuse, and also to make any recommendations they wish to make. These sessions will be externally facilitated, and we will be shortly issuing a tender for the services of a facilitator who will assist in the process of planning and scoping the sessions, and then we will take them forward. But again, to stress, those sessions will be independently facilitated, and they will be independent of the Department, because we are conscious that survivors want those sessions to be by survivors for survivors, as the survivors say. And thirdly, Quite recently, we have convened an interdepartmental committee to examine how existing mainstream services can best help the needs of survivors into the future. That committee met for the first time on the 5th of November, and it will meet again in December. And what we are doing as a starting point is basically to compile an inventory of all of the various state services and supports that may be of relevance to survivors, and also look at issues like signposting and whether those services are sufficiently attuned, and how survivors can best be directed to those services and benefit from them. So I thank the committee for its attention, Chair. Thank you, and that concludes my statement.
Okay, thank you, Ned. I'm going to go to the members now, and firstly, Senator O'Loughlin.
Thank you, Chair. If I do have to leave, it's because I have to go up and move some amendments on the Greyhound Bill, so I will obviously, be back in and look at responses and stuff. So thanks for coming in today and for the presentation. I suppose to start off with just kind of responding to some initial points, I think it's very hard for me when I hear things like, teething problems in the beginning and things are working out and things are changing, and there's a downturn in complaints, when what we're dealing with in terms of our offices and the different supports we provide to survivors tells a very different picture. And I would wonder why, there's a downward turn in complaints. Maybe people are so fed up they're 18 months to 2 years in some cases, trying to actually just get white goods for their kitchen. They're probably just going, you know what, I give up. Some of them have probably passed away. We don't really know why that downturn is there. It doesn't necessarily mean it's positive. And the whole idea of a person-centred approach, I think of one man who not only has a social worker advocating for him, has me stepping in trying to advocate for him, and still, after years of going through this process, the most he has managed to get is a skip. He hasn't been able to get simple white goods for his kitchen, because when he goes to Paddy Power, he's told, no, you can't get it in Paddy Power because we need to pay it in this way, whether it be through bank transfer or cheque, and then he sent somewhere else, and then he sent somewhere else. And all these years on, he still can't just get a simple, stuff for his kitchen. That's not person-centred. I mean, I wouldn't put myself through that degrading treatment every time of nearly having to practically beg for a washing machine or a cooker. And that's what it feels like, I suppose, when you have to keep coming back with more information and more information. So I don't believe that it's person-centred. I have a couple of questions that are very focused, I suppose, on the department's role, and I welcome the consultation with survivors. I think it's going to be extremely important, and I suppose it'd be great to kind of be, as a committee, to be kept updated, I suppose, on how that's going out, or if we can, I suppose, support that process in any shape or form. But for me, I also feel that what we need to be asking for is an independent investigation into the operations of Carranua and the treatment of survivors by Carranua. And I think whether that feeds into the process that's happening with the consultation, or whether there's an independent investigation into the operations. And I think what's really crucial there is also looking at the current chair and CEO. And I think while there's a consultation process, and while there's still applications, I suppose, that haven't been met, maybe we need to bring in an independent chair. I know we were saying Carranua was independent, but if we bring in, I suppose, the department actually to find an independent chair and independent acting CEO, while we're actually trying to process some of those applications that are kind of just getting lost in the ether. But in relation to the department's role, I'm wondering, in what way is the department supervising Carranua, particularly given the widespread reports of poor treatment of survivors? How would you describe Carranua's performance of the last 4 years, particularly bearing in mind the objectives of the fund, which is to help the recovery of survivors? What measures did you use to come up? What measures did Carranua use to come up with their 90% performance rate? It's like we're just taking this 90%, but nobody really knows what the measurement was. Nobody has seen a report. I know the past board members weren't part of any sort of survey or report that came up with that 90% satisfactory performance rate. Carranua committed to a review of the impact of the 2016 changes to services, including impact of the introduction of the limit of the 15,000 by June 2017. Has that review been carried out, and what were the conclusions of that review? There's also evidence that the imposition of a cap has had devastating consequences for the applicants with the greatest need. Would the Department wish to comment on that? Given evidence to both PAC and the Education Committee, Carranua committed to improvements in communication. The improvements included reaching out to applicants where they lived, the provision of interview facilities at the new premises. Of concern to the committee is whether Carranua have successfully reached out to the most vulnerable, which they had stated they would in their past meetings, such as those in hospitals, prisons or on the streets, as there is no evidence so far of this. The RIRU is the department tasked with providing support to Carranua and redress issues generally. RIRU is reported to be in the process of winding down its operations with a view to closure in the very near future. Given Carranua's imminent closure, is it the best time to close the RIRU, and might it be better for this team to remain to ensure that any post-Carranua measures are embedded and to help ensure Carranua's closure is achieved with the minimum disruption to survivors? Thank you.
Okay, thank you then, Deputy Martin. Thank you very much for coming in today. I was sort of struck by something there in your opening statement where you said the department is of course aware that there is a degree of dissatisfaction with the quality of the service provided by Carranua. I think there's much more than a degree of dissatisfaction. I think what was said in this committee meeting earlier this year is that, I repeat it, the state has failed. But worse still, it continues to fail, and that is to our shame as a state. Just before I ask questions, I will just commend and reference all those who have and continued to advocate so courageously, never given up, so resilient against all the odds for the survivors. And it's incredible what has been done by the survivors for the survivors. My questions centre really around the issue of the appeal process. So what are the department's concerns regarding the very different number of appeals granted by the former appeals officer, only 8% successful, compared to the 2 appeals officers appointed in April 2017 that changed to 43% appeals successful? And how have the officials satisfied themselves that the former appeals officers were not overly harsh, looking at the difference in those statistics? How does the department explain the very low number of appeals submitted by applicants to the fund, 399 over 3 years? Is the number low because of Carranua's failure to tell applicants they can appeal? Again, a symptom of poor communication. Considering the very high number of appeals won by applicants since 2017, how has the department ensured that Carranua's refusals are fair and in line with the Act, particularly as we have reports of this not being the case? Similarly, the appeals process itself, there has been allegations of abuse of the process on the part of Carranua during the appeals, for example, introducing new reasons for refusing once the appeals process has commenced, and refusals on grounds not contained in the Act or the criteria. Are you aware of these allegations? If yes, what have you done to look into these allegations? And has the department ever seen a list of the reasons given by Carranua in the determination letters and or further reasons for refusal only given after the appeals process commenced? And if the department hasn't seen them, perhaps it would like to ask to see them and perhaps consider that information. Also, we've heard of several applications for services made in 2015 by applicants who have serious disabilities who need help urgently and are still waiting. So in these cases, we believe Carranua initially refused to issue a determination letter, then only agreed to issue the letter 12 months later after an investigation by the appeals officer. They were then refused the service. The applicant successfully appealed in 2017 after waiting 18 months for the appeal decision, or have still not been provided with the service. So are you aware of these particular applications? Have you any information on them? Is that the case? Some applicants who were interviewed recently on radio I believe are now considering legal action, and it's estimated that the cost for these cases could exceed 500,000, and that this money might well come out of the fund. So have you received reports of this? At what stage, if it is coming out of the fund, do you step in to prevent the fund from such losses? What do you think of such cases and what they tell us about the operations of the fund by Carranua? And what can we as a committee and you as a department do now to improve matters for survivors in the time the fund has left? Because really, as a service that has failed to provide services and with provide survivors with a service. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Deputy Senator Paul Gavin.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks to you all for coming in. I want to start, if I may, with a quote from Tom Cronin, who appeared in front of us just a few months back, a former board member of Carranua. I think it's important to just remember the people we're talking about here and what they've gone through. So Tom said to us, "What happened to us as children was a shame on the nation, but what has been done to us since is a greater shame. As a survivor, I've experienced the anger, hurt, despair and frustration of engaging with the Redress Commission and other state-established resources. As a survivor advocate for more than 20 years and a former board member of Carranua, I have personally witnessed many survivors experiencing the same. These schemes and the state's response to our past have failed on an ongoing fashion for one reason, namely that they never listened to survivor needs." Now, as you can hear from that quote, I mean, the testimony, I think we'd all agree, was absolutely powerful on that day from Tom and indeed from Dr. Mary Lodato as well. And I have to tell you, we have unanimity across all parties here, I suspect, because all parties have had representations telling us of the appalling experiences at the hands of Carranua. I have to tell you that only this morning I heard that someone who handed in an application, physically handed it in, received a dressing down. How dare you come down to our offices? Now, how can you imagine that as an appropriate response? This happened in the last month, by the way, to someone who suffered abuse. What kind of culture is there in Carranua, the organisation, that makes it okay to act like that? It's absolutely shocking. And I would appeal to you, because I think we have to work together here. We're not here to give you a hard time. We just need to make sure that Tom's request is followed through, that they are listened to. That we have to recognise that. And I want to echo my colleague Senator Ruan's call for an independent investigation. We need that because we're unable to produce a report here. We can't produce a report as a committee, we're told, because of conflicting evidence. Now, we can't leave it as it is. So we have to have an investigation, independent investigation. Otherwise, we've failed to listen again. And I don't believe any of us, including yourselves, would want to leave it in that position. I'm calling for an independent investigation. I'm calling as well for a new management structure to be put in place as a matter of urgency to make sure that things do improve from here on in. I have a couple of questions. I'm going to rattle through them. You have a lot of questions to answer here today. I'm conscious of that as well, so I'll get through as many as I can briefly, Chair, and then hand over to our colleagues. My questions are around the processing of applications. I'm sure you'll agree that Carranua's primary role is to accept and process applications, applying the criteria to each case, and to either pay for the service or to give the applicant a written determination letter giving the reason for the refusal. What can the department tell us about the 2016 Appeal Officer's investigation of Carranua and their refusal to process applications? We believe that at the time Carranua put these breaches down to, and I quote, an oversight on their part. Second question, what has been the department's reaction each year to the, and again I quote, serious concerns raised in each of the Appeal Officer's annual reports published in 2016, 17 and October 2018? Carranua still refused to process applications. They still failed to issue written determinations. They still failed to give information about the right of appeal. The Taoiseach said only last month he wanted evidence of this. We assume he has been directed to these reports. And I'm a little concerned about the statements that you make in your opening statement where you say that people are now receiving written determinations, because that's not what the appeal officer is telling us. In the report that he produced just last month, he says, and I quote, "We continue to experience cases on this issue." So I don't understand how you could put that line in when the appeal officer's own report tells us that that's not the case. The evidence from the appeal officers and the other reports demonstrate these failings are widespread and affect hundreds, if not thousands, of applicants. How has the department responded to the reports of this? Given these practices have been ongoing for 4 years, in the department's estimation, how many applicants may not have had their applications properly determined and thus denied a right of appeal? I think it's important that we know that, and if in fairness, if you don't know that, then that just tells us again why we need this independent investigation. The Minister has power to direct under the Carnura Act, and while it would be improper for the Minister to give directions in respect of an individual case, it would seem appropriate for the Minister to issue a direction to Carnura to compel it to act in accordance with the Act and to stop the unlawful policy of delaying or refusing to process and determine applications. In the context of these widespread abuses, why didn't the Minister direct Carnura to act in accordance with the statute at any point in the last 3 years?
Just in a point of principle, you cannot ask public servants to answer for the Minister.
Chair, you're right, and I apologise. That's a fair point. Absolutely. I withdraw that.
Or to use the term unlawful either.
Okay. Accepted?
Okay, thanks, Senator.
Many applicants to the funds will not have read the Act or the appeal officer's report. They will not know that their application was denied unfairly. So how does the department ensure that the survivors who are illiterate or have only limited literacy, or perhaps they're in institutional care, how do they ensure that they receive the service they're entitled to, given these breaches would have been ongoing for 4 years? And I'll finish up with this because I'm conscious that there's a lot of questions here, Chair. And again, thank you for your patience. We understand that a request was made to Carnura and the Appeals Officer for information to be made available to applicants of agencies that may be able to help them. For example, FLAC, the Citizens Information 1 and 4. And we understand that Carnura refused to do this, which is really shocking, really, isn't it? And I just wonder, I'd like to hear your view on that. What is your view about Carnura's refusal to make that information available? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Deputy O'Sullivan.
Thanks, Chair, and I'd just like to welcome you first of all, and I'd like to start by just responding to some of the points that Mr Costello made, one being that the Department acknowledges the problems, and I think it's important that you do acknowledge the problems, and clearly my colleagues have asked a number of very specific questions around the problems, but I just want to pick up on a couple of things you said. One was that there is a commitment to call people back within 24 hours. And then to repeat the phone calls. So I just wanted to ensure that that actually happens. And one of the things that was said to me was that the free phone, I think, only operates on landlines. So are they calling back? You know, most people now operate through mobile phones. So just a very specific question around that. You know, that people would be called back on their mobile phones if that's their preferred, because most people aren't there to take a call on their landline, to be quite honest. And then also on what you said about people have been notified in writing on their right of appeal from a particular date. I think it was a date this year, if I'm not mistaken. So just if you can just clarify that. And just specifically on that, because a lot of the complaints that we've got were around people who didn't know they had a right of appeal. So is that historic, or is it just people currently who have been turned down? Because people who've been turned down in the past, I would certainly request that they would also be notified of their right to appeal, because many people may not have known that. And just specifically on the limit of 15,000, I know you're saying that that was a decision of Carnura rather than of the department, but again, can the department point out, for example, that as people get older and more disabled, they may need an extension to their house, for example, which is going to cost more than 15,000. Again, there are specific cases around that. You know, you did say, and indeed Carnura have said it as well, that in their strategic plan, that as the level of applications has now reduced, we can concentrate on improving the quality and impact of our intervention with survivors. So we would like to know what evidence is there of that, and specifically to ask that, that in that context, that they would look at, you know, there probably are people in the system who need something bigger than what is contained under the 15,000. So I'd specifically ask around that. And then just some very specific questions around the problems that people have in actually getting what they're looking for, and Senator Ruan raised some of those around white goods, etc. But people are being asked for several quotes, for example, and not only the price and description of the work, but also the materials to be used. So, you know, if the department, I don't know how much guidance you can give them, but it seems to me like if you're applying for any kind of grant with the local authority, you have to get quotes, but you don't have to give all that level of detail. And also, I understand there are preferred suppliers that you know, are being chosen by Carranua. Again, can you clarify if that's the case? Because that doesn't seem to me to be the norm under procurement rules. So these are some of the difficulties that the people are actually having in terms of getting what they need, and just the difficulty of the forms in general. And again, I don't know if Senator Gavin raised the issue about literacy, but some people have limited literacy and have difficulty with the forms, which I think Carranua again have themselves, or the Independent Appeals Officer has said that the application process is extremely complex. So again, you know, is there help there for people in terms of these complex forms? So I think I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you, Deputy. Senator Gallagher.
Yeah, just for the purposes of avoiding repetition, I'll confine my contribution to questions, if I may, Chair. Just in relation, first of all, in relation to issues around governance and management, from reading the board's minutes, it would appear the board seems to focus more on governance rather than trying to improve the services, and I'd welcome your comments on that. How do the department ensure that the board of Carranua is achieving the correct balance between governance on one side and the objectives of the fund on the other? And how can the board, which on the face of it doesn't appear to consider greatly the needs of survivors, when you examine the minutes from talking to survivors, board members, is that working effectively in your opinion? How did the department react to the concerns raised by 2 survivors, board members, who resigned earlier this year in relation to the treatment by the Order Non-Survivor Board? Perhaps you might make a comment on that. And also, when you look at there's lots of negative feedback in relation to Carranua's treatment of survivors, and no doubt I would be interested in how the department reacted to those reports and what steps have been taken to improve the service delivery. Carranua also published a report on feedback earlier this year, claiming that 90% positive feedback from the dial debates at present, and from indeed comments within this room today, one would have to question that particular feedback. And can the department comment on findings of an independent survey carried out in 2017 which showed a different picture? 68% of survivors rated that the experience with the advisor as either terrible or bad. 61% rated their experience as either extremely negative, and 21% rated their experience as negative. Perhaps you might make a comment around those particular results from an independent survey that was carried out.
Thank you, Senator. Deputy Funchion.
Thanks, Chair, and I'll be very brief because nearly everything has been covered at this stage, and I know Senator Gavin has done a lot of work in relation to our party regarding this. I just wanted to make the point that it's hard to find the words to describe that. Like, for the history of these people, they've been failed completely by the state. Like, first of all, obviously in these institutions, and then in this process. And it's sort of like there's this attitude from Carranua that, well, you know, kind of people aren't deserving of this money, or even the fact that there's a cap and that they will kind of decide what they think the cap could be. I understand that maybe money is obviously not, you know, it's not unlimited, but surely that should be done on an individual case, because people have varying needs and different needs, and the fact that it's just a one-all cap, I just think it shows their attitude from the start that it's sort of very begrudging. The appeals, I just wanted, there's really only a few brief points I want to make. In relation to the appeals, like, I've had conversations with people in Carranua where they say there is no appeals process. So the fact that they're now saying that there is an appeals process, or they're writing out to people, there's huge questions around that, because I've dealt with a lot of people who've been told there isn't an appeal. I've then had follow-up conversations with people in Carranua myself, and they've been told no, there's no appeal system in relation to this. So I'd like to know a little bit more about that. And in relation to this, the closure, I mean, I don't think Carranua is fit for purpose or doing a good job, but at the same time, what happens to people who maybe have slipped through the cracks, who haven't actually applied for the funding, or who were abroad or weren't aware of it? what happens to them, and who's going to decide what hardship or exceptional circumstances is, because the very basic things that people are looking for now, they don't seem to be able to get. So what makes anyone believe that Carnua will even grant anything which is they deem as hardship or exceptional circumstances? And just the last point I want to make is that supports going forward, and I do welcome the consultation. I think that's a great idea. But one of the supports you mentioned is the HSE's National Counselling Service. I mean, they're completely overstretched as it is. People who are literally suicidal can't even get access to that service. And you're looking at a very vulnerable group of people. There's no way they're going to be able to get access to that service. So if it is winding down, I would suggest, as part of the consultation, that some sort of specific counselling services be available free of charge for people, or through some sort of system, but certainly directing people to a national HSE counselling service which is completely overstretched and is not going to be able to meet the demands. I wouldn't recommend that. Thanks, Chair. And we have votes now, I see. So.
Yes, thanks, Deputy. Yeah, I just add a comment myself, and then I'm going to have to suspend the votes. Genuinely sorry about that. Just the points that I would make myself. I accept that there will be a post hoc review on redress schemes in general, but the point has been made by colleagues here, and I absolutely agree that there should be an independent investigation into the operation and management of Carnua, and that should be commissioned and carried out by the department, and I would be interested in knowing if there is scope and the likely time frame for such. Following on from that, obviously these survivors are people who have been in very vulnerable situations. They have been let down and they have been failed, and when Carnua is wound up, certainly I would anticipate that extra supports would be needed for the survivors. So if you could give an indication of what supports would be there for that. Looking at the €18 million which was available in the investment account by the end of September this year, that's a lot of money to have in the account while there has been a hold-up in relation to paying to survivors. Is that kept there because there's a backlog, or is there a specific reason? And also the cap on €15,000. It does seem quite small. The decision of Carnua came, they said, from survivors, but there wasn't consultation with the survivors. So, and I accept it was Carnua who said it, not yourselves, but maybe you might give us a sense of why that would be. You'll have to excuse me now, please, and as soon as I come back, we will carry on. Thank you. So this is now suspended for votes. But obviously with Dáil votes, we were under an obligation to vote the Dáil deputy members. So we're now going to resume the meeting, and all of the members had an opportunity to put their questions to the department officials. So I'm going to go directly back. So Ned, will we start with you?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And if it's okay, Chair, I might try and take the questions thematically, because there's a lot of common threads in the themes. Just firstly on the question of the failure of the state. There is no question that the state failed all of those who were incarcerated in residential institutions, and that is brought out abundantly clearly in the Ryan report, which does make for harrowing reading, and the Taoiseach did apologise on behalf of the state to all survivors of institutions. That was clearly significant, and there, as I say, there can be no question that the state failed, and that is fully acknowledged and has been acknowledged. I suppose it was partly on foot of that the Residential Institutions Redress Board was established, and the payments of approximately €1.2 billion in redress payments were made to survivors, to the approximately 15,000 survivors that received a payment from that board. And the Carnua funding is funding that is on top of those redress payments that were made. I mentioned in the opening statement that the fund is a finite fund, and it's a statutorily limited fund, and that is significant, because I think that a significant amount of the tensions that arise actually derive from the fact that there is a limited fund. I might just talk about some of the things that have been raised, because a lot of them centre around the 15k limit. And if you were to look at the population of survivors, and if it had been approached in a different way, and if a flat payment had been given to every survivor who already got an award from the redress board, that would have involved a payment of approximately 7,000 per survivor if it had been done on a simply flat basis. It wasn't done that way, and the initial approach was to have an entirely open-ended fund, entirely needs-based, and there's an inevitable tension between that kind of an approach and a limited fund and the population of survivors who had received a redress payment already, but who might need further assistance from the fund, and that resulted, while again I have to stress that these decisions are like statutorily independent decisions of Carranua, that did result in, as one would understand, concerns about proportionality, and that is the reasoning underpinning the 15k limit, because the organisation would have been conscious of the fact that there were cohorts of survivors that had not been reached to date, and the organisation would have been conscious of that in the context of the balance of the fund remaining, and the need to take as equitable an approach as possible. And it's clear that there are different views on that, which actually I might touch on the issue of legal cases that was raised. So yes, the department is aware that there's a legal challenge. It's complicated. It's complicated, so I won't possibly confuse things with the detail. But essentially, the legal challenge relates to the 15k limit and the application of the 15k limit, and we have to see where that legal challenge goes.
And as that is subdued to say, I won't allow any further comment in relation to that.
Thank you, Chair. So as I say, there is a balance that, as we would understand it, that the organisation is trying to seek between a needs-based approach and then the fact that it has a limited fund, and it is trying to get to as many survivors who may have a need as possible. In that context, and it's addressed in the annual report of the organisation, the most recent one, there is a specific focus on trying to get to survivors who haven't benefited from the fund so far, and a lot of the organisation's outreach efforts are being directed in that regard, and they did pick up before the cessation date. They did pick up a number of survivors that they haven't gotten to. If I were just to talk about some aspects of people who are waiting a long time, I think that issue is somewhat contextualised by the fact that it's not a one-shot application process. So you would have a number of clients of Carranua who would have made multiple applications, and so therefore may still have applications in process, and that is reflected in the statistics. Because in terms of the latest statistics, to the end of October, Carranua had received 6,526 applications. Of those, 5,936 were confirmed as eligible or deemed to be eligible. But it also has 2,365 open applications. So there's still quite a volume of applications that are open. As I say, that doesn't mean that a client hasn't already received a payment from Carranua, because they could have a second or third or a fourth application in. So there's quite a number of applications still to be worked through, and that also then raises the question of why would money be held back? I think you raised that yourself, Chair, and that is because Carranua needs to ensure that it has adequate funds to cater for the applications that it has on hands, and that is also why it instituted the closing date for applications, because it didn't want to be taking applications and then running up a bill, as it were, that it wouldn't subsequently be able to discharge. Some questions were raised also in the making of applications about literacy issues and so on. And that's why Carranua is operating on an application advisor support. So a person who comes and makes an application is assigned an advisor. So it's not simply a paper-based process. There is a person to assist them. In that as well, and again without exceeding the role of the department and commenting on in detail about the operations of Carranua. The operations of Carranua are funded from the fund, so there is always a balance to be struck between the amount you spend on operations and the amount you spend on the actual payments to individuals. And again, that's something that's a balance that the organisation and the board of the organisation has to strike. Also in that general area about kind of applications and the process, some questions were raised about the preferred supplier issue, quotations and so on and so forth. On that specific issue, on the preferred supplier piece, Carranua did pilot two projects in 2014-15 with the Clwyd Housing Association and then with SEAI, the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland. Those were piloted actually based on feedback from survivors regarding the difficulties in sourcing appropriate suppliers to provide quotes. However, the organisation found that less than 100 survivors actually participated in both of those schemes. So it was an attempt made to assist, but there wasn't a great take-up of it, so it hasn't been pursued. As regards the applying the quotes and that issue, survivors are asked to provide quotes for the work where the cost is less than 1,000, only one quote is asked for. Where the cost is between 1,000 and 5,000, two quotes are required, and above that, three quotes are required. So there is a balance being struck between a proportionate balance between the amount of the size of the works and quotations being sought. Again, I commented on that in the opening statement. The propriety issues, irregularity, propriety, and so on, have been raised in relation to Carranua, and the organisation has to have regard for that. And look, it's understood that it's a vulnerable population of people. A balance has to be struck. But clearly, if there's an entirely laissez-faire approach to that type of issue, well, then it does raise a question of that process not being respected, and that creates other issues. On the question of customer satisfaction, a number of specific, well, not very specific issues have been raised about specific applications and so on. Chair, we can't comment on those. It's a statutorily independent body, and inevitably, as a result of that, we wouldn't have the information, nor in terms of respect for the independence of the body would it be appropriate for us to be querying specific applications. However, members of the Oireachtas, of course, can contact Carranua. There is a dedicated Oireachtas email address. I know the body will be very happy to pursue any specific instances that deputies would wish to raise with it, and to take those up. We're aware of the survey that was referred to. I think it was a survey of a relatively small number of applicants out of the 6,500. Caranua's statistics are somewhat more broadly based, but they're not comprehensive either. It would have to be said. So I suppose there is a question of customer satisfaction surveying. Again, there's a question of balancing how much you spend on that. That costs money versus providing the supports for survivors. Is there anything else that I should say in this round? Yeah, sorry. There was questions were raised about the appeals. Actually, Kathleen, you might say a word on it.
Yeah, we've tried to, when we realised that a backlog was building up in relation to the number of appeals outstanding, we decided that the best course of action would be for the Minister to appoint 2 appeals officers. So 2 appeals officers were appointed in May 2017. And in May 2018, the 2 appeals officers, they were offered reappointment. Only one accepted the offer because of personal reasons. The other person couldn't. But at that stage, the appeals backlog had been eliminated. And I think our stats at the moment show that there are less than 50 appeals. Is it 45 appeals? 45 appeals, of which 8 have only come in the past week. So the department actually provides the administrative support to the appeals officer. So it's because of that we're in a situation that we're able to monitor and keep a very close eye on. If the appeals backlog starts to build up again, then obviously remediation measures will be taken. But also it's as well to point out that the appeals process isn't necessarily straightforward in that the person who appeals, Carnew, have the right to respond on the basis of that appeal. So we know of one particular case where the applicant was written to over a year ago, and the appeals process hasn't been concluded yet, on the basis that there's still information being sought. So the appeals process, we do know as well as that at the moment, when all paperwork is complete and the appeals officer actually gets the completed file, that his decision on average has taken just 5 weeks to conclude. Unfortunately, the statistics, and because of the backlog and because of the legacy issues that were there, the statistics really skew the length of time that people are waiting to hear the determination of appeal. Like, we're very conscious that the population of people out there have particular needs, and that they are an ageing population, and what no process wants to do is actually further distress people. And Ned mentioned the whole issue about applicants being assigned to an application advisor. That's the way Carnew operates. When they get an application and an application advisor has an availability, that person will be assigned to a particular individual who will take over their case. Deputy O'Sullivan mentioned the issue about the phone calls. We've been assured that whatever phone call that the person chooses to use, that's the phone that Carnew will actually use to communicate with the person. The volume of phone calls is such that the preferred method of communication is by phone. And again, going back to the literacy issues that people are talking about, there is a realisation that if there are people with literacy issues, the preferred method of communication would have to be on the phone basis. And I would just like to add as well that Carnew, when it was established, it was designed that it would complement and not replace state services. So in terms of an ageing population and in terms of, say, the mainstream services that are out there, in terms of assistance with housing or whatever like that is, our job in setting up the interdepartmental committee is to look at how mainstream services can support people as they age, and whether the existing services that are out there, like the assistance with bathrooms or whatever, the housing adaptations, whether these are sufficient to enable survivors to continue to live in their own homes for as long as they wish to. And I think as well, in talking to Carnew have continually said to me that if, as a department, we ever want to go and sit in and listen to how they deal with people, or indeed, I think the invitation has also been extended to members of the Oireachtas, if they actually want to visit Carnew and see how they're dealing on an individual basis with survivors, then they would be more than welcome to do so. Obviously, it's something that would have to be cleared, and survivors would be made aware of such a situation happening. And again, because we have no access to and cannot access the personal data that's held on individuals, if there are instances, and Deputy Gavin referred to it, where an individual was treated ignorantly by Carranua staff at their premises, then if the Deputy could raise that directly with Carranua, who I'm sure would be very anxious to correct any such mistreatment of people.
Okay, thank you, Catherine.
I might come on a couple more points, Chair.
Yes,
okay.
go ahead, Nat.
Sorry, thanks, Chair. A question was raised about the future of the Residential Institutions Redress Unit. Just to explain, so the so-called RURU is a unit within my division, within the department, that essentially deals with anything to do with institutional abuse or other cases of abuse, for example, in day schools that have arisen as well in the past. There is, unless, well, obviously the structure of the department is ultimately their political decisions evolve, but there are no plans to close down the Residential Institutions Redress Unit. In fact, to the contrary, because we've a large work programme. We have the interdepartmental committee, we have the post hoc review, we have the continued oversight of Carranua. They're all major issues. We have, and actually just to mention as well, so we have the retention of records bill that we were before the committee previously on for pre-lay scrutiny. We will have that hopefully coming forward in the course of next year as well. We will also be actively looking at the question of memorialisation, which I think is of concern as well, because I think, as members of the committee are aware, there was a memorial planned a number of years ago for the Garden of Remembrance that didn't get planning permission, and there is still very much, particularly as we come up to the anniversary of the Ryan report, there's very much a live issue about how we do commemorate and memorialise and mark this regrettably very sad period in Irish history. So those are all activities that we will be focusing on in the coming year. In relation just to the board of Carranua, and I suppose questions of investigations and kind of boards and so on they're ultimately political decisions, but I do want to let the committee know that we expect that the Minister will shortly fill the 2 board vacancies on the board of Carranua, and those will be filled by survivors, so that will be happening shortly as well.
Okay, thank you, Ned. Angus, do you want to add anything to it? Just purely on clarification, if anybody wants clarification in anything that Ned or Catherine said, I'm happy to allow clarification. Kathleen.
Just on the appeals, I had asked a question about people being told that there wasn't an appeals process. Like, what is the story with that, or where did they go from here? Thanks.
Apologies for not responding to that. The appeals process is statutory. It's provided for in the Act, and that's why there are the appeals officers. There was, I referred to earlier, but I'll restate it. There was a period when, and this is reflected in the reports of the appeals officers that were referred to. There was a period historically where it has to be said that people weren't sufficiently made aware of their right to appeal, and that was corrected from mid-16. People are informed, they're informed in writing. We've provided sample letters of the correspondence that people get to the committee and the supplementary information that we've been provided. So that piece of, I suppose, what was bad practice has been corrected. I think actually, and I might say as well, Chair, just that the question was raised, I think it was by Senator Luan on the volume of complaints issue. We would be aware, and I hope we've attempted to make it clear to the committee that there has been a significant focus since around the middle of 16 by Carranua on customer service issues, and we would believe, I suppose there can be other interpretations taken, but we would believe that there actually is a correlation between the fact that people are less dissatisfied now than they were in that earlier period of Carranua's operations, and certainly the current acting chief executive whom obviously we meet in terms of our overall governance supervisory role, we meet regularly, is absolutely dedicated to customer service, and we would suggest that the improvements are actually being seen. But unfortunately, I suppose there's a legacy period where I said that, I called it teething troubles, but kind of establishment troubles or whatever, where the organisation was getting off the ground, finding its feet, trying to develop processes from a greenfield site, and the experience of people from that period clearly is still having repercussions, and we're still hearing them today.
Okay, thank you, Ned. Senator Gavin.
Thank you. Just 2 quick points, if I may, of clarification. The first is, and again, I know you've had a lot to answer, and I appreciate that, but I still don't understand why you've put in the statement, since mid-2016, applicants to Carranua whose applications are not approved are notified in writing of their right to appeal and how to go about this, when the appeals officer himself, in the report he published just 1 month ago, says we continue to experience cases on this issue. That's a fairly fundamental difference from the appeals officer. That's the first point of clarification.
Sorry, give your second one and then we'll go back to it.
Okay, certainly. Yeah. The second one is, I mean, you've spoken about customer service and the passion of the CEO. It was the CEO who ran that applicant from the building 3 weeks ago. And I'm saying this because there's a huge contradiction here, which is why I think all of us are asking for an investigation.
Well, that is hearsay, and you know we cannot comment on somebody who isn't here to defend themselves. So I'm going to disallow that particular question. Deputy Martin wants a clarification as well.
Just to clarify on that survey, the 90% positive feedback, where you're saying is you don't have any details on that, and we have to contact Carranua on that.
No. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No, go ahead and yeah.
No. What I said was that the number of responses to the survey, they're around 300 in an average year. So clearly, what I said was that that's not an entire. That's clearly not. It's not a census. It's a survey. That's what I said on that specific point. What I said, I think, on the point that you're referring to, Deputy, is that the department, in respect of Carranua's operational independence from the department, and indeed client confidentiality issues, the department can't pursue individual cases in relation to Carranua's decisions, but that members of the Oireachtas, of course, can pursue any of those cases directly with Carranua.
It does strike us as quite unusual, 90%, that figure, positive feedback, considering that's not what we hear. That's just the question. And has that not struck the department as a little bit strange? And is there, when you go back to the governance, and you do have a role in oversight and accountability there, I know that does that not strike you as, from what we've read and the stories even before this committee, that 90% is a little bit odd?
Sorry, can I just kind of come in here maybe and clarify? It's the feedback that Carranua get from their client base, and of the feedback they receive, 90% is positive. So just to clarify that.
The which?
Sorry, so 90% of
they look for
the feedback
on their website. They publish statistics on feedback, and of the feedback they receive, 90% is positive.
Of the feedback they received?
Yes.
Which is sorry, Chair. Which is essentially the point that I'm making, that it's not a population survey, but I think there's if this is not too technical, there's a frequency and a volume, there's an amplitude kind of and a frequency issue here, in the sense that there may be people who are extremely dissatisfied, and then there may be a large body of people that are generally satisfied, and that may explain an apparent disjunction.
Okay, but I think it's something that we need to delve into.
One other,
just very quickly.
Yeah, just in relation to the free phone number, is that only free phone from a landline, or is it a free phone from the UK? Because I think 40% of the survivors in the UK. How exactly is it free from a mobile? Is it free from a landline? The free phone number.
We'll check and come back to you on that, Deputy.
Okay, there's something we need to establish.
Well, yeah, and if there's would be a desire for it.
Okay, thank you. No,
I have to respond to Deputy Gavin.
Yes, yeah.
If that's all right.
Yeah, please do.
Our belief is that still refers to the legacy period, and the reason that we believe that is that in addition to the fact that we have the documentation and have supplied the committee with the documentation as to what happens, Carranua did actually ask, I think it was members of the Oireachtas, who had raised, Carranua has asked people to come back and let them know of any individual instance where somebody did not receive the information, and they haven't had anybody come back to them and say, they've asked members, I think it was members of the Oireachtas they asked, was it? Sorry, I beg your pardon, not members of the Oireachtas, sorry, Chair, let me correct that. Carranua is in regular contact with the advocacy groups, and they asked the advocacy groups to bring them forward any cases where somebody had received.
Does that include the UK? Does that include Britain?
Yeah.
Okay.
There is contact with
the number of applicants there is very, very,
Senator, through the Chair.
Okay. I mean, it just strikes me that the number of applications from Britain is particularly low, and I think it's another indication of the fact that they really haven't succeeded even in reaching out to victims over there. I mean, there's so much evidence here in terms of Carranua not being fit for function, and I don't understand.
You cannot, as I would have reminded you before we started, you cannot make comments like that about an organisation that is not here to defend themselves.
I kind of have to. I hear what you're saying. Yeah, someone has to say it.
Okay. Well, look, I think we've had a very interactive session. I know members aren't, not all members would be happy with some of the responses that we have had, but I think that there's a lot of food for thought, and this doesn't end here for any of us. Like, we all have an onus and a duty here at committee level to think about, what you have said in your submissions and what you have said to us. And as a committee, we will be considering how we want to progress this. However, I certainly think that a likely recommendation will be that an independent investigation would be commissioned. And we've heard that from a number of members, and I think that we will have at a future stage an opportunity to say what we would like to have covered in that independent investigation. A number of the members did query as to whether you thought that a review would happen, and we didn't necessarily get a response that a review would be happening. So I think it's going to be incumbent on us as a committee to make a recommendation to the Minister in relation to that. But it is a very sensitive, a very delicate situation. We're very conscious that we're representing thousands upon thousands. I know that by the end of, I think, 2017, there was almost 5,500 people who had come forward, and there's no doubt that it probably is way more than that in terms of figures. And we obviously want to have all of the survivors dealt with in a very understanding, compassionate and practical way as well, in terms of all of their needs, and bearing in mind that a lot of though survivors did actually emigrate from Ireland to England and to try to make a particular contact overseas with the population that are there. But we do appreciate your coming in, Ned and Catherine and Angus. And as I say, we will be coming back to this again. You want to make a point of clarification?
Yeah. My apologies, Chair. I think I mightn't have made this sufficiently clear just in relation to what you've just said, that one of the things that certainly we will be doing is that in our consultation process with survivors, we are going to ask them for their views and their feedback on both Carranua and the redress schemes generally. So we are going to garner further feedback on the feelings of survivors on that.
Thank you. That consultation is absolutely vital, and we appreciate that. And can we ask that it would be as fulsome and as wholesome as possible, contacting all of the individuals who would have contacted Carranua, not just a cohort that may be easy to have a consultation with. I think that we would feel that everybody should be. So that is the end of this part of the agenda. And with the members' agreement, I propose that we defer consideration of the private housekeeping matters until next Tuesday. Is that agreed?
Unless
Yes.
it's inconvenient for members, I'd like a private session now, if that's possible. But if it's not convenient, then I won't put people.
No,
Okay.
a number of
Okay.
members had indicated to me.
Fine, that's fine,
Is that okay?
absolutely fine. But
Okay.
I'd like this. I'd like this issue put on the private meeting. What we've just said.
Oh, we will, absolutely. Yeah, we will, absolutely. As there is no other business, this meeting of the Joint Committee is adjourned until 3:30 on Tuesday, the 20th of November.